After I dropped my daughter off at the airport for a supposed business trip, my 7-year-old grandson tugged at my sleeve from the back seat. His voice was trembling as he whispered, "Grandpa, we cannot go home tonight. I heard Mom and Dad planning something terrible. They are sending men to take you away." 10 minutes later, I was hiding in a neighbor's dark tool shed with my grandson holding my breath as a black, unmarked van pulled into my driveway. Men stepped out carrying heavy sedatives and a straitjacket. I realized my own flesh and blood had just sold my life away. My name is Alton Reed. I am 70 years old, and before I tell you how I dismantled their entire lives, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against family who tried to destroy you for greed. It started on a gloomy Tuesday evening. My daughter Kendra had asked me to drive her to the airport for a last-minute corporate conference in Chicago. Her husband Wyatt, a man I had always tolerated but never respected, had conveniently stayed behind at their mansion, claiming he was dealing with a crisis at his failing tech startup. During the drive, Kendra was tense, tapping her manicured nails against her expensive designer handbag. She barely looked at me when she kissed my cheek at the departure curb, rushing into the terminal without looking back. I pulled away from the curb, merging onto the highway with my grandson Leo sitting quietly in the back. Leo was usually a chatterbox, always asking questions about the buildings we passed, but tonight the boy was dead silent. About 10 miles from my estate, Leo unbuckled his seatbelt. He leaned forward over the center console, his small hands gripping the leather of my seat. He looked absolutely terrified. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "We cannot go home. Mom did not go to Chicago. I heard her and Dad talking in the kitchen last night when they thought I was asleep. They said you have too much money and you are not dying fast enough. They hired people to wait for you at your house tonight. They are going to drug you and lock you in a bad place forever so they can take everything." A cold chill washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. A lesser man might have dismissed this as a child having a nightmare or misunderstanding an adult conversation. I did not. In my 40 years of building commercial real estate, from the dirt up, dealing with cutthroat contractors, corrupt city officials, and ruthless competitors, I survived by following one unbreakable rule. You never ever ignore your gut feeling. And right now, my gut was screaming that the boy was telling the absolute truth. Kendra had seemed too eager to have me drop her off. Wyatt had been too absent. I immediately took the next exit, steering my heavy SUV off the main highway and plunging into the dark, quiet suburban streets. I did not drive to my gated driveway. Instead, I parked my vehicle 2 streets over, hiding it behind a thick row of overgrown hedges near an abandoned property. I grabbed Leo's hand and we walked silently through the dark back alleys. We crept into the overgrown yard of my neighbor, an elderly man who was away for the winter, and slipped inside his rusted wooden tool shed. Through the cracked, dirty window of the shed, I had a clear, unobstructed view of my own front gates. We waited in the suffocating darkness, the smell of old motor oil and damp earth filling our lungs. I held Leo close, feeling his small heart beating frantically against my chest. We did not have to wait long. Less than 10 minutes later, a large, black, unmarked van rolled silently up my street. Its headlights were completely turned off. It parked directly in front of my wrought iron gates. The sliding doors opened and 4 large men stepped out into the crisp night air. They were not wearing police uniforms or casual clothes. They were dressed in dark clinical scrubs, looking exactly like private medical contractors. One of them carried a heavy, reinforced medical bag. Another man unfolded something thick and canvas under the glow of the street lamp. It was a heavy-duty straitjacket. The leader of the group walked straight up to my front door. He did not pick the lock. He pulled out a shiny silver key, unlocked my door, and led the men inside. Kendra had given them a key to my home. They were not there to rob me. They were there to legally kidnap me, heavily sedate me, and drag me into some private psychiatric facility under false pretenses so Wyatt and Kendra could seize control of my real estate empire. Lights began flicking on inside my house. I could see their shadows moving aggressively past the windows, searching every room. Suddenly, the back door of my house swung open. One of the contractors stepped out into the backyard holding a high-powered flashlight. He swept the beam across the lawn, moving closer to the property line. He was walking straight toward the neighbor's shed where we were hiding. I pushed Leo gently behind a stack of heavy fertilizer bags, putting my finger to my lips. I reached out blindly in the dark, my calloused hand wrapped around the cold, heavy iron of a rusted crowbar resting on a workbench. I gripped it tight, my knuckles turning white, prepared to do whatever was necessary. The heavy footsteps crunched on the dry grass outside the shed. The wooden door creaked open, and the harsh beam of the flashlight pierced the darkness. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I swung the heavy iron crowbar with all the strength my 70-year-old arms could muster. The iron connected with a sickening crack against the side of the contractor's knee. He let out a muffled grunt of agony as his leg buckled. Before he could shout, I brought the crowbar up and struck him squarely across the jaw. He collapsed to the dirt floor completely unconscious. I dropped the crowbar, grabbed Leo by the collar of his jacket, and pulled him out of the shed. We ran blindly through the narrow, dark back alleys, navigating the shadows, our breath pluming in the cold night air. I pushed my aging body to the absolute limit until we finally reached the hedges where I had hidden my SUV. I shoved Leo into the passenger seat and jumped behind the wheel, my hands shaking as I shoved the key into the ignition. I turned it violently. Nothing happened. The engine did not roar to life. It did not even click. I pulled the hood release lever and jumped out, shining my phone light into the engine bay. My heart sank. The main ignition wires had been cleanly and professionally severed. They had tracked me. They knew exactly what vehicle I was driving. I slammed the hood shut. We had no car, and the men in the van would be waking up soon. We were completely trapped on foot in the dead of night. I slammed the heavy steel hood of the SUV shut and grabbed Leo by the shoulder. We could not stay here. If they had tracked my vehicle, they were already fanning out across the neighborhood to secure the perimeter. I hoisted my 7-year-old grandson onto my back for the first half mile, my 70-year-old knees burning with every agonizing step. We moved like shadows through the manicured lawns and dark alleyways of the affluent suburbs. The crisp night air bit fiercely at our lungs. Leo was shivering, burying his face deep into the collar of my heavy wool coat. He did not cry, but I could feel his small frame trembling with pure exhaustion and terror. I set him down when my back threatened to give out, gripping his small hand tightly in mine. We walked for 2 grueling miles, navigating blindly through the labyrinth of dead-end streets and service roads, avoiding the glaring glow of streetlights. My mind raced, operating with the cold precision that had built my real estate empire. I needed to get us out of the city, far away from Wyatt and Kendra's immediate reach. Finally, the flickering neon glow of an old 24-hour diner cut through the darkness ahead. It sat isolated near the edge of the interstate. It was a temporary haven, a place to regroup and figure out how to launch a counterattack. We stepped into the diner. The warm air and the heavy smell of stale coffee and fried grease hit us instantly. Only a few tired truckers occupied the worn leather booths. I guided Leo to the furthest corner booth, positioning us where I could clearly see both the front entrance and the emergency exit in the back. I told the weary waitress to bring the boy a large hot chocolate and a plate of fries. I needed him distracted. I needed cash. Leaving Leo safely tucked in the booth, I walked over to the bulky ATM sitting near the restrooms. I reached into my wallet and pulled out my primary platinum debit card. In the commercial real estate business, liquid capital is a weapon. I never rely on standard banking hours. I have always maintained specialized corporate crisis accounts that allow me to withdraw up to $50,000 in cash at a moment's notice, day or night. It was a financial safety net I built decades ago after a corrupt contractor tried to bleed one of my construction sites dry on a holiday weekend. I slid the heavy metal card into the machine, swiftly entering my secure personal identification number. I pressed the option for a maximum daily withdrawal planning to hire a discreet private driver to take us across state lines. The machine whirred for a fraction of a second before the screen abruptly turned bright red. Bold, glaring text flashed across the digital display. Transaction declined. Account frozen. Conservatorship active. I stared at the screen. The words felt like a physical blow to my chest. Conservatorship. I pulled the card out and inserted a different one linked to a completely separate offshore holding company. The machine whirred again. The same bright red screen appeared. Transaction declined. Account frozen. My pulse quickened. A conservatorship meant a court order. It meant someone had legally convinced a judge that I was completely incapacitated. To freeze accounts across multiple banking institutions at this hour of the night required extreme legal authority. Wyatt and Kendra had not just planned to lock me away. They had already legally severed my access to my own empire. I needed answers immediately. I could not use my cell phone knowing Wyatt could easily track the GPS signal. I walked past the restroom and pushed open the swinging doors into the diner's greasy kitchen. I pulled a crisp $100 bill from my money clip, handed it to the bewildered dishwasher, and pointed to the grime-covered landline phone hanging on the wall. He took the cash and quickly stepped outside for a smoke break. I dialed the direct unlisted number of my private wealth manager, Richard. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was laced with sheer, unfiltered panic. "Alton," he stammered, his breath catching in his throat. "Where are you? The police were at the bank 3 hours ago. What is going on?" "Richard," I demanded, my voice low and lethal, "why are my accounts locked?" Richard swallowed hard. "Your son-in-law, Wyatt. He came into the executive office with a team of lawyers and police escorts. He had an emergency ex parte medical injunction signed by a superior court judge. They filed a petition for immediate conservatorship. He submitted sworn affidavits claiming you are suffering from severe violent dementia and that you are an immediate physical threat to your family and yourself." I gripped the plastic phone receiver so tightly I thought it would shatter in my hand. "That is impossible," I said. "A judge does not sign an emergency conservatorship without verified medical proof from a licensed attending physician." "I know," Richard replied, his voice shaking. "Wyatt had the proof, Alton. He presented a signed comprehensive medical evaluation. It was signed by your personal physician. Dr. Aris testified on paper that your cognitive decline is absolute and irreversible." The room spun. Dr. Aris was a man I had known for 20 years, a man whose medical clinic I had personally funded when he was just starting out. Wyatt had gotten to him. My own trusted doctor had signed away my sanity. "According to the court order," Richard whispered, "Wyatt now has complete legal control over your estate, your properties, and every single cent to your name. You are legally stripped of everything, Alton. I am sorry." I hung up the phone. The betrayal was complete. I was officially a ghost in my own life. I stepped out of the kitchen, my mind calculating the brutal reality of my situation. I walked back toward the corner booth where Leo was sipping his hot chocolate. Suddenly, a shrill, piercing alarm tone echoed from the television mounted above the diner counter. It was the emergency broadcast system. The late-night sports recap vanished, replaced by a glaring red banner. Amber Alert. The waitress stopped wiping the counter. The truckers turned their heads toward the screen. 2 high-resolution photographs appeared side by side on the broadcast. One was a picture of Leo, the other was a photograph of me. The news anchor's urgent voice filled the diner. "Police are searching for 7-year-old Leo Mitchell, who was abducted this evening by his grandfather, Alton Reed. Authorities warn that Reed is suffering from violent dementia and is considered highly dangerous and unpredictable. If you see this man, do not approach. Call 911 immediately." Every head in the diner slowly turned from the television screen toward our corner booth. The waitress dropped her rag. My grandson looked up at me, his eyes wide with fear. Before anyone could move, the distinct high-pitched wail of police sirens began echoing in the distance, cutting through the cold night air, growing louder by the second. The wail of the sirens grew louder, piercing through the greasy diner air like a physical threat. I stood perfectly still. The waitress behind the counter dropped her coffee pot. It shattered against the linoleum floor, but no one flinched. Every pair of eyes in that diner shifted from the glowing television screen directly to our corner booth. The silence was absolute, heavy with sudden recognition and terror. The burly trucker sitting at the counter slowly reached for his cell phone. A woman in the booth next to ours pulled her purse closer to her chest and slid out of her seat, backing away toward the front door with wide eyes. I had been in hostile corporate boardrooms where hundreds of millions of dollars hinged on a single facial expression. I knew the look of an impending strike. I had less than 60 seconds before someone in this room dialed 911 and the police swarmed the building. I did not panic. Panic is for prey. I reached down, grabbed Leo firmly by the hand, and pulled him out of the booth. "Do not look at anyone," I told him in a low, steady voice. "Keep your eyes on my shoes and walk fast." The trucker at the counter stood up, stepping into the aisle to block my path toward the front entrance. I did not break my stride. I locked eyes with him, projecting the same cold, ruthless intimidation I used to crush competitors decades ago. "Move out of my way," I commanded. The trucker hesitated visibly, intimidated by the sheer unyielding authority in my voice, and stepped aside just enough. I did not head for the front door. I pulled Leo sharply to the left, crashing through the swinging double doors that led straight into the chaotic, grease-stained kitchen. The heavy doors swung shut behind us, cutting off the stares of the panicked patrons. The kitchen was sweltering and smelled of burnt oil. The dishwasher I had bribed earlier was scrubbing a stack of plates, but my eyes locked onto the line, cook standing near the back exit. He was wiping down a grill. A man with a hardened, exhausted face, faded prison tattoos on his forearms, and a nervous energy that told me he wanted absolutely nothing to do with the police. I marched directly up to him, backing him against the heavy metal emergency exit door. "Listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice cutting sharply through the hiss of the deep fryers. "The police are going to walk through those front doors in exactly 30 seconds. I need a vehicle and I need a clean phone right now." The cook scoffed, wiping his hands aggressively on his dirty apron. "Man, you are crazy. Get out of my kitchen before I yell for help." I did not argue or negotiate. I unclasped the heavy gold band of my watch and slammed it onto the stainless steel prep counter. It was a vintage solid gold Rolex. My late wife Helen bought it for me the day I closed my very first $1 million commercial development deal. It was the only piece of jewelry I ever wore, a physical symbol of everything I had built from the dirt up. "It is worth $20,000 at any pawn shop in the city," I told him, keeping my eyes deadlocked on his. "Give me your car keys and your burner phone. You walk out the front door, tell the cops you saw us run into the woods, and you keep the watch to start a new life." The cook stared at the gleaming gold face, then at the wailing police cruisers flashing red and blue lights through the front diner windows. He did not hesitate. He reached into his pocket, slapped a set of worn keys and a cheap prepaid cell phone onto the counter, and snatched the Rolex. "Silver Honda out back," he muttered. I pushed open the heavy emergency exit door, dragging Leo out into the freezing alleyway. The silver Honda was a rusting, dented liability, but the engine miraculously turned over on the first try. I threw the car into drive and sped down the gravel back alley with the headlights completely turned off. We tore onto a deserted service road just as 3 police cruisers screeched into the diner parking lot behind us. I drove recklessly through the industrial outskirts of the city, checking my rearview mirror every 10 seconds to ensure we were not being followed. Leo sat in the passenger seat, his knees pulled up to his chest, clutching his seatbelt with trembling hands. "You are doing perfectly, Leo," I assured him, keeping my tone entirely steady to mask the burning, violent rage churning inside me. "We are going to a safe place right now. No one is going to take you away from me." I drove us toward the riverfront, navigating through a maze of abandoned factories and decaying shipping yards. I pulled the Honda into a massive, condemned industrial warehouse. I secretly owned this specific property through 3 layers of anonymous corporate shell companies. Wyatt and Kendra did not even know it existed. The heavy metal rolling door slammed shut behind us, plunging the warehouse into pitch-black isolation. I turned on the overhead halogen lights illuminating the dusty concrete floor and led Leo into the fortified manager's office on the ground level. I locked the deadbolt and handed Leo my heavy wool coat to use as a blanket. "Stay away from the windows," I ordered gently. I stepped back out onto the main warehouse floor and dialed a number on the cheap burner phone. Jonathan picked up on the first ring. Jonathan was my lead corporate attorney. He was a ruthless, morally flexible shark who owed his entire lucrative career to the immense wealth I generated for his firm. Alton Jonathan practically shouted into the receiver, "The entire city is looking for you right now. The police just raided your primary estate." Wyatt went on national television 20 minutes ago crying about how you violently kidnapped his son. I ignored the sheer panic in his voice. "Jonathan, listen to me. I need to file an emergency counter-injunction." Wyatt froze my accounts. "We need to tie this up in federal court before morning and completely drain the capital from his holding company." "Alton, you are not listening to me." Jonathan interrupted, his voice cracking with a miserable mix of terror and professional defeat. "We cannot file a counter-injunction. We cannot do anything. The legal trap Wyatt set is completely ironclad." I slammed my fist against a steel support beam, the sound echoing through the empty warehouse. "Nothing is ironclad in the legal system, Jonathan. Find a loophole right now." "There is no loophole," he insisted frantically. Wyatt did not just find some random corrupt judge to sign off on a shaky affidavit. The judge only signed the emergency conservatorship because the severe dementia diagnosis was heavily documented, officially verified, and sworn under oath by your trusted personal physician of 20 years. Wyatt got Dr. Aris to sign the medical mandate. As long as that medical signature remains on the official court record, you have 0 legal rights. You are a ward of the state, Alton, and an active fugitive. I stared at the cold concrete floor as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal settled into my bones. Wyatt was a desperate fool, but he had successfully turned my closest medical confidant into the executioner of my freedom. I hung up the phone without another word. I knew exactly what my next move had to be. I stared at the burner phone in my hand, processing the brutal reality of Jonathan's words. I could not walk into a federal courthouse to fight for my empire while my face was plastered across every television screen as a deranged kidnapper. As long as that sworn medical document existed, I was nothing more than a violent fugitive with a rotting brain. The law would not protect me. I had to destroy the foundation of Wyatt's lie directly at its source. I walked back into the fortified manager's office. Leo had curled up under my heavy wool coat on the small leather sofa, completely exhausted by the terror of the night. His breathing was deep and even. I locked the heavy deadbolt from the outside, ensuring no one could get in, and armed the warehouse's internal security perimeter. I climbed back into the cook's rusted silver Honda and sped back out into the freezing night. The dashboard clock read 3 a.m. The city was a ghost town, the streets slick with a thin layer of frost. I navigated the empty avenues with dangerous speed, heading toward the upscale medical district. I was not driving blindly. I knew exactly where Dr. Marcus Aris spent his late nights analyzing patient files. He was a workaholic, a trait I used to admire. Now it was a weakness I was going to exploit. I parked the Honda in the dark alley behind the sprawling modern medical facility. I did not care about subtlety anymore. I needed answers, and I was going to extract them from the man I had trusted with my life for 2 decades. I approached the clinic's rear staff entrance. The electronic keypad flashed a solid red light. 30 years ago, before I dominated the commercial real estate market, I purchased this exact plot of land. I personally financed the construction of this state-of-the-art facility to help a brilliant but broke young doctor start his private practice. I built the security infrastructure myself. I knew the physical override code for every door in this building. I punched a 6-digit sequence into the keypad. The heavy steel door clicked open instantly. I walked silently down the pristine white corridors, my footsteps completely muffled by the expensive carpeting. I saw a thin strip of light bleeding out from beneath the heavy oak door of the primary executive office. I did not knock. I kicked the door open with a violent shove, the wood slamming loudly against the wall. Dr. Aris jumped so hard he knocked his coffee mug across his mahogany desk. The hot liquid ruined a stack of patient files. He was a frail man in his late 60s, clutching his chest in pure terror. He stared at me as if a ghost had just walked into his sanctuary. "Alton," he gasped, his face draining of all color. "You are supposed to be." I crossed the room in 3 massive strides, grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive designer coat, and slammed him back against his plush leather chair. "I am supposed to be locked in a psychiatric ward wearing a straitjacket," I finished for him, my voice a lethal whisper. "You signed a sworn affidavit declaring me violently insane. I built this clinic for you. I gave you your entire career. Give me one good reason why I should not end it tonight." Aris trembled violently, his hands gripping my wrists as he struggled to breathe. I did not let go. I squeezed the expensive fabric tighter, lifting him an inch out of his chair. Wyatt forced me. Aris choked out tears spilling over his wrinkled cheeks. "I swear to you, Alton, I had no choice. He would have ruined me." I shoved him back into the chair in disgust. "Wyatt is a failing tech CEO, drowning in a sea of his own incompetence," I snarled. "He does not have the power to ruin anyone. What leverage did that arrogant fool have over you?" Aris buried his face in his hands, completely broken. "The medical trials," he sobbed. 5 years ago, I approved a series of experimental pharmaceutical treatments for wealthy clients. There were severe complications. 3 patients suffered catastrophic organ failure. I falsified the autopsy reports to hide my negligence. I paid off the medical examiners to protect the clinic. If the medical board found out, I would lose my license. I would go to federal prison for the rest of my life. I stared at the pathetic man crying behind his expensive mahogany desk. Wyatt's failing tech startup specialized in data aggregation. He must have used his company's illegal scraping algorithms to breach the clinic's secure servers and uncover the falsified death certificates. "Your malpractice gave my son-in-law the bullet he needed to shoot me in the back," I said, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You traded my freedom for your own skin." Aris looked up, his face slick with tears. "Wyatt came to me last week. He showed me the stolen files. He said he owed millions to dangerous people. He needed immediate liquid capital, and your estate was his only target. He demanded I sign the dementia evaluation to trigger the emergency medical injunction. He promised that once you were permanently committed, he would destroy the evidence of my malpractice. I had to do it, Alton." He cornered me. "You are a coward," I told him coldly. And you just made the biggest mistake of your life because Wyatt has absolutely no intention of leaving loose ends. Right on cue, the sleek digital phone on Eris's desk began to ring. The caller ID display flashed brightly. It was Wyatt. Eris looked at me, completely paralyzed by fear. "Answer it," I commanded, pointing at the speaker button. "Put him on speaker." Eris pushed the flashing green button with a shaking finger. Marcus Wyatt's arrogant voice echoed through the silent office. "I saw the news. The old man escaped the medical transport. He is a fugitive now." Eris swallowed hard. "Wyatt, you promised me this would be clean. My clinic is exposed." "Relax," Wyatt replied dismissively. "I am tying up all the loose ends right now. I just dispatched my private cleanup crew to your location. They are going to wipe your servers and physically destroy Alton's original medical files so the court can never verify the fraud. They are pulling up right now." Suddenly, harsh, blinding headlights flooded the clinic's large glass windows, casting long, menacing shadows across the office walls. A heavy black SUV parked illegally on the front curb. I moved swiftly to the blinds and peered through a narrow slit. 4 men dressed in dark tactical gear stepped out of the vehicle, racking the slides of suppressed automatic weapons. They were not here just to destroy files. They were here to silence the doctor permanently. The heavy glass of the clinic's main entrance shattered downstairs, the sound muffled by the silencers attached to the cleaner's weapons. I heard the crisp, synchronized crunch of tactical boots stepping over the broken glass and moving efficiently into the first-floor lobby. They were not sweeping the building like amateur thugs. They were moving in a calculated tactical formation, securing the exits before advancing toward the main staircase. Dr. Eris collapsed behind his mahogany desk, whimpering uncontrollably as the reality of Wyatt's betrayal finally sank in. He clutched his thinning hair, completely paralyzed by the imminent threat of death. I did not have time to comfort a coward. I grabbed Eris by the collar and dragged him away from the illuminated windows, forcing him down into the shadows near the heavy oak door. We were trapped in the primary executive office on the second floor. The clinic had been designed with premium security in mind, which meant the exterior windows were sealed shut and constructed from shatterproof polycarbonate glass. There was no balcony, no fire escape leading down from this specific room. The heavy footsteps echoed on the marble staircase, steadily climbing to our level. They were less than 60 seconds away from breaching the door and executing us both. Eris began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as he stared at the door. "I told you," he choked out, his voice a pathetic rasp. "Wyatt does not leave loose ends. We are going to die in here." I released his collar and stood up, my mind instantly shifting from the rage of betrayal to cold, absolute survival. I looked up at the pristine drop ceiling and the discreet high-tech ventilation vents. Eris was a dead man if he stayed paralyzed, but I had absolutely no intention of dying in a building I financed. I stepped away from the trembling doctor and moved swiftly toward the discreet utility panel embedded in the wall behind a framed medical diploma. Decades ago, when I tore down the original condemned lots to build this state-of-the-art facility, I oversaw every single aspect of the architectural design. I do not just sign checks. I memorize blueprints. I know the structural load capacity of the steel beams, the blind spots in the security corridors, and the exact routing of the commercial-grade ventilation systems. Building this place required fighting off aggressive zoning boards and rival developers. I learned early on to always build an invisible advantage into my properties. I ripped the framed diploma off the wall and smashed the glass cover of the utility panel with my elbow. I bypassed the standard electrical switches and reached deep into the cavity to locate the primary HVAC control box. Beside it was the manual override for the emergency chemical fire suppression system. This specific system was designed to protect the highly volatile chemical storage rooms in the basement. But as the developer, I had the architects wire a centralized manual override directly into the executive office to give the head physician total lockdown control in case of an emergency. The tactical footsteps reached the second-floor landing. I could hear the muted clicks of their weapons being raised, the subtle hand signals they were exchanging just outside the oak door. Eris squeezed his eyes shut, sobbing into his hands, accepting his execution. I gripped the heavy red lever inside the wall panel. I did not build my empire by surrendering to hired guns. I yanked the lever downward with all my strength, simultaneously twisting the HVAC master dial to maximum output. Instantly, the clinic erupted into absolute chaos. Deafening emergency alarms shrieked through the corridors, accompanied by flashing strobe lights that shattered the darkness. From the ceiling vents in the hallway, the chemical fire suppression system deployed with terrifying force. Thick, blinding, heavy industrial foam blasted out at maximum pressure, instantly flooding the corridor outside the office. I heard the armed cleaners shout in sudden panic as the dense chemical agent compromised their tactical vision and choked their suppressed weapons. The heavy oak door of the office splintered inward as they blindly fired a volley of bullets through the wood, desperately trying to breach the room. The rounds chewed through the mahogany desk and shattered the computer monitors, but they were firing blindly through a wall of expanding foam. I dropped low to the floor, crawling fast toward Eris. "Give me your master keycard," I commanded over the blaring sirens. He just stared at me, frozen in shock. I did not ask twice. I ripped the lanyard from his neck, securing the plastic keycard. "You have exactly 30 seconds to find a place to hide before they clear the foam," I told him coldly. I crawled toward the adjoining private bathroom, swiping the keycard to unlock the reinforced door. Inside the bathroom, hidden behind a sleek wooden panel, was the commercial laundry chute. I specifically ordered the construction crew to reinforce the chute with industrial steel casing to handle heavy, wet medical linens. It was wide enough for a grown man dropping straight down into the basement utility room. I pried the panel open, feeling the vibration of another barrage of bullets slamming into the office walls. The cleaners had kicked the remaining pieces of the door down, stumbling into the room covered in chemical foam, firing wildly into the shadows. I did not wait to see if Eris survived. I grabbed the edge of the steel casing and threw myself feet first into the pitch-black chute. I slid down the smooth metal in total darkness, gaining terrifying speed before crashing violently into a massive pile of canvas laundry carts in the basement. The impact knocked the wind out of my lungs, but I rolled off the carts instantly, ignoring the sharp pain radiating through my spine. I sprinted through the basement corridors using the master keycard to bypass the security doors and burst out through the loading dock exit into the freezing night air. I sprinted through the dark alley, my lungs burning, and threw myself into the rusted silver Honda. I slammed the vehicle into gear and tore out of the medical district, my tires screeching against the frost-covered asphalt. The wail of police sirens was already approaching the clinic in the distance, responding to the automated fire alarms. I kept my foot pressed hard against the accelerator, weaving through the abandoned industrial streets until I reached my condemned warehouse. I quickly parked the car and rushed to the fortified manager's office, unlocking the heavy deadbolt. I pushed the door open, expecting to find Leo sleeping soundly under my wool coat. Instead, I found a nightmare. Leo was writhing on the cold concrete floor. He was clutching his throat, his face pale, gasping desperately for air in shallow, jagged wheezes. His chest heaved with violent effort, his eyes wide with sheer panic. The overwhelming stress and terror of the night had triggered a severe, life-threatening asthma attack. I dropped to my knees, pulling him into my arms, searching his pockets frantically. There was nothing. His specialized prescription inhaler, the only medication that could open his airways and save his life, had been left behind in his bedroom at Wyatt and Kendra's highly secured mansion. I knelt on the freezing concrete floor, cradling Leo's shivering body against my chest. His breaths were shallow, terrifyingly rapid gasps that rattled deep in his lungs. His skin was turning a sickening shade of pale. Every instinct I possessed as a grandfather screamed at me to pick him up, throw him into the passenger seat of the rusted Honda, and speed to the nearest pediatric emergency room. But the cold, calculating mind of the businessman knew the brutal reality. An amber alert with my face and his was flashing across every television billboard and police cruiser dashboard in the state. The moment I walked through those sliding glass hospital doors, I would be violently tackled to the ground and handcuffed by armed security. I would be locked away in a high-security psychiatric ward under Wyatt's medical injunction, and Leo would be handed directly back to the very monsters who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. I could not rely on the system. The system was actively hunting me. I laid Leo gently back down on the leather sofa, wrapping my heavy wool coat tighter around his shivering shoulders. "I promised you that I would protect you, Leo," I whispered, forcing my voice to remain perfectly calm and steady to prevent his panic from escalating. "Just hold on for a little while longer. I am going to get your medicine." I locked the fortified manager's office from the outside once again. I sprinted back to the silver Honda, the tires violently spitting gravel as I tore out of the warehouse. I was driving straight into the belly of the beast. I was heading to Wyatt and Kendra's heavily fortified estate. The sprawling modern mansion sat behind a massive wrought iron gate in the city's most exclusive gated community. Wyatt loved to boast to his country club friends about the impenetrable military-grade security system protecting his home. He paraded it around as a symbol of his tech success. What he conveniently left out of his arrogant speeches was the fact that he was nearly bankrupt when they bought the house, and I was the one who had personally written the check to the security firm. I did not just pay for the cameras and the laser grid. I oversaw the installation. I demanded a hardwired analog override code programmed directly into the mainframe, a sequence known only to the lead engineer and myself. I parked the Honda half a mile down the road, slipping through the dense woods lining the back of the property. I avoided the motion sensors I knew were mounted on the oak trees and approached the rear service door. I flipped open the sleek digital keypad, bypassed the touchscreen entirely, and punched my hidden 8-digit sequence into the physical emergency panel beneath it. The heavy deadbolt clicked open with a soft, satisfying thud. The alarm panel flashed green, completely disabled. I slipped inside the dark, silent house. I navigated the familiar hallways with absolute precision, moving like a ghost through the shadows of my daughter's lavish, unearned lifestyle. I bypassed the marble foyer and headed straight up the carpeted stairs to Leo's bedroom. I found his bright red medical bag sitting exactly where he always left it, right on his bedside table. I quickly grabbed the pressurized rescue inhaler and shoved it deep into my pocket, ready to extract myself from the house. I turned away from Leo's bedroom, my primary objective secured, and moved silently back toward the main staircase. As I passed the sprawling master suite at the end of the hallway, a sliver of warm yellow light bled out from beneath the heavy mahogany door. My footsteps ceased instantly. Wyatt was supposed to be at the police station playing the role of the devastated father for the media, and my daughter was supposed to be halfway to Chicago for a corporate conference. Yet a voice was echoing clearly from inside the bedroom. It was not the television, and it was not Wyatt. It was Kendra. I pressed my back flat against the cold hallway wall, inching closer to the slightly ajar door. I peered through the narrow crack. Kendra was pacing frantically back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. She had not boarded the flight to Chicago. She had never even stepped foot inside the airport terminal after I dropped her off at the departure curb. She had orchestrated the entire trip as an alibi, ensuring she was completely removed from the scene while the fake medical contractors raided my home. She was still wearing the designer trench coat from the airport, but her perfectly manicured demeanor had completely evaporated. She was clutching a cell phone to her ear, her knuckles white, her face twisted in an ugly mask of sheer desperation and vicious anger. Her voice, usually so sweet and heavily curated for public consumption, was a harsh, venomous hiss. "I told you to give us until the end of the week," she spat into the receiver, running a trembling hand through her hair. "You sending those goons to the house does nothing but draw unwanted police attention. Do you think threatening my husband scares me? Wyatt is a weak, incompetent idiot who has ruined everything he has ever touched. He took your money, yes, but I am the one fixing his mess." I held my breath, the magnitude of the betrayal cementing itself in my mind. She was not a passive participant in Wyatt's scheme. She was actively managing the fallout. I slowly pulled the cheap burner phone from my coat pocket and hit the audio record button, holding the microphone close to the gap in the door. I needed every single syllable of this conversation preserved. "You listen to me very carefully," Kendra snarled into the phone, her tone dropping into a chilling, sociopathic calmness. "I know Wyatt owes your boss $5 million. I know where the money came from, and I know what your organization does to people who default on black market loans. But you will get your $5 million in cash by Friday morning. The legal injunction is already active. We have frozen his entire commercial real estate empire. The moment the court officially transfers the assets, the money is yours." The voice on the other end of the line murmured something low and threatening. Kendra did not flinch. She simply stared at her own reflection in the bedroom mirror, a cruel smile forming on her lips. "My father is no longer a problem," she promised the cartel loan shark. "The old man is being permanently liquidated as we speak. If you are hooked on this story, what do you think I should do next? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below." The cold reality of those words slammed into my chest with the force of a freight train. Wyatt was an arrogant, failing fool, but he was merely the instrument. The architect of my destruction was my own flesh and blood. Kendra, the daughter I had protected, financed, and loved unconditionally since the day she was born, was the true mastermind. She had willingly orchestrated a $5 million debt to a cartel, planning to use my execution to settle the ledger and maintain her opulent lifestyle. The sheer scale of her sociopathy left a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I stopped the recording on my burner phone, securing the digital file that would eventually destroy her. I did not confront her. Confrontation without leverage is a fool's errand. I slipped away from the master bedroom door, retracing my steps through the sprawling mansion with absolute silence. I bypassed the advanced security grid, once again stepping out into the freezing night air. I sprinted back through the dense woods to the rusted Honda, my lungs burning, fueled entirely by a newfound lethal clarity. The father who had loved Kendra died standing in that hallway. The ruthless tycoon who built a real estate empire from dirt took complete control. I drove back to the condemned warehouse like a man possessed, breaking every speed limit. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt of the manager's office. Leo was still writhing on the concrete floor, his lips turning a dangerous shade of blue. I dropped to my knees, pressed the inhaler firmly to his mouth, and administered 2 rapid doses. It felt like an eternity, but slowly the agonizing wheezing began to subside. His airways opened. The color returned to his cheeks. He clutched my shirt, exhausted but breathing freely. I wrapped him tightly in my coat, promising myself that his mother would pay for every single gasp. With Leo finally stabilized and sleeping soundly under my heavy coat, I knew exactly what my next move required. I could not fight a multi-million-dollar legal battle, freeze out a cartel, and dismantle my daughter's life using the spare cash in my wallet. I needed untraceable liquid capital, and I needed the foundational blueprints of my corporate empire. I left Leo locked safely inside the fortified office, arming the perimeter alarms, and drove the Honda across the city toward my primary heavily gated estate. The property was a fortress currently surrounded by bright yellow police tape and completely locked down by local authorities. They believed they had secured the scene of a violent kidnapping. They did not know the man who built the house always kept a ghost protocol. 35 years ago, before the digital age forced every financial transaction under a microscope, I operated in a world of cash deals and handshake contracts. I learned never to trust a banking institution with my absolute survival. When I built my primary study, I instructed the lead carpenter to construct a false floorboard beneath the heavy Persian rug. Beneath that solid oak plank was a reinforced fireproof safe. It did not hold sentimental family heirlooms. It held $500,000 in untraceable bearer bonds and a set of military-grade encrypted hard drives. Those drives mapped every single shell company offshore account and routing number associated with my real estate empire. I parked the Honda half a mile away, hiking through the thick, thorny brush of the adjoining property, to approach my estate from the camera blind spot near the guest house. The yellow crime scene tape fluttered violently in the cold wind, stretching across my massive mahogany front doors. A single police cruiser sat idling at the end of the long driveway, the officer inside visibly distracted by the glowing screen of his smartphone. I did not use the main entrance or the garage. I slipped through the deep shadows of the manicured garden, approaching the side access door leading directly into my private study. I used a physical skeleton key I always kept hidden inside a fake sprinkler head near the rose bushes. The heavy lock turned with a soft, satisfying click. I stepped into my own home like a seasoned burglar. The study had been completely ransacked. My extensive library of books was thrown across the floor, and my heavy desk drawers had been violently pulled out and dumped. Wyatt and Kendra had clearly searched the room frantically, looking for bank passcodes or physical stock certificates before the police arrived. They were complete amateurs. They destroyed the surface while remaining completely oblivious to the foundation they were standing on. I moved swiftly to the center of the room, rolling back the heavy Persian rug. I pressed my thumb against a specific, unnoticeable knot in the oak floorboard, applying pressure until it slid smoothly to the left. The concealed digital keypad glowed faintly in the dark. I punched in the 12-digit sequence and pulled the heavy steel hatch open. The safe was perfectly intact. I pulled out the thick stacks of bearer bonds tightly bound in plastic bands and shoved them deep into my coat pockets. These bonds were effectively pure cash, completely untraceable by any government agency or banking institution. I grabbed the sleek black hard drives next. With these heavily encrypted devices, I could digitally reconstruct and drain every single asset Wyatt thought he controlled. I had the capital. I had the ammunition. I was ready to wage absolute war on the family that betrayed me. I zipped my coat, preparing to slip back out into the night and return to my grandson. As I reached to close the heavy steel hatch of the floor safe, a loose piece of pristine white paper caught my eye. It was half buried under the wreckage of my overturned desk drawers, clearly dropped in Wyatt's frantic rush to tear the room apart. I picked it up, expecting it to be a discarded bank statement. The bold black lettering at the top of the page made my blood run instantly cold. It was a high-risk corporate life insurance policy. The primary insured was Alton Reed. The sole beneficiaries were Wyatt and Kendra Mitchell. The payout was $10 million. I scanned the dense legal text, my eyes locking onto a specific, heavily highlighted paragraph at the bottom of the page. It was a double indemnity clause. The policy would pay out a staggering $20 million if the insured died from an accidental cause while actively under the custody of psychiatric transport. The entire narrative shifted into a horrifying lethal clarity. The unmarked van, the heavy sedatives, the fake medical contractors, they were never planning to lock me away in a facility. They were planning to murder me on the highway and claim it was a tragic accident. $20 million. That was the precise, calculated price tag my own daughter and her husband had placed on my life. I stood perfectly still in my ransacked study, clutching the heavy parchment of the corporate life insurance policy. The sheer magnitude of their depravity eradicated any lingering trace of paternal hesitation I might have harbored. The unmarked black van parked in my driveway, the men dressed in clinical scrubs, the heavy sedatives, the canvas straitjacket. They were never planning to transport me to a secure psychiatric facility for a prolonged legal battle. They were planning to murder me on the highway. A heavily sedated elderly man dying of an alleged heart attack or respiratory failure during an involuntary medical transport would easily be classified as a tragic accident by a corrupted or negligent medical examiner. The double indemnity clause would instantly trigger. They would walk away with $20 million in clean, untraceable insurance payouts, completely bypassing the messy probate process of liquidating my commercial real estate empire. I folded the document with steady hands and slipped it inside my coat pocket next to the thick stacks of bearer bonds. I was no longer dealing with a rebellious, entitled daughter and a greedy, incompetent son-in-law. I was actively dealing with heavily indebted, cold-blooded assassins. Hiding in a condemned warehouse and playing defense would only delay my inevitable execution. They had the legal system manipulated through Dr. Aris, the local police actively hunting me via the Amber Alert, and ruthless cartel enforcers hovering in the shadows waiting for their massive payout. I could not simply run away and hope to clear my name. I had to utterly obliterate their entire financial, social, and structural infrastructure before Friday morning. I slipped out of my violated home, melting back into the freezing night air. I navigated the dense, thorny brush, completely undetected by the idle police cruiser at the end of my driveway, and made it back to the rusted Honda. I drove back to the warehouse with a singular lethal focus. The time for hiding was officially over. The counteroffensive was about to begin. I arrived back at the isolated warehouse and immediately checked the fortified manager's office. Leo was still breathing, steadily wrapped safely in my thick wool coat, completely oblivious to the war I was preparing to wage. I locked the heavy deadbolt from the outside and pulled a heavily encrypted military-grade laptop from the stash I had retrieved from the hidden floor safe. I did not log onto the standard monitored internet. I accessed a decentralized dark web network I had utilized years ago to verify the deep hidden financial backgrounds of corrupt city politicians and aggressive corporate rivals. Decades ago, when I transitioned from small local developments to dominating the commercial skyline, I learned a brutal, unforgiving lesson. You do not treat absolute betrayal as a messy family dispute. You treat it as a hostile corporate takeover. In a hostile takeover, you do not negotiate, you do not compromise, and you do not show mercy. You systematically dismantle the enemy's supply chains, freeze their operating capital, and isolate their leadership until they suffocate under the pressure. I reached out to an elite underground cybersecurity syndicate known only by a numeric proxy. They were digital mercenaries who operated strictly on untraceable capital and guaranteed absolute destruction of target networks. I photographed $50,000 worth of the bearer bonds, proving my immediate liquidity, and offered them a massive premium for priority unrestricted access. Within 10 minutes, a secure encrypted communication channel opened on my screen. I gave the lead hacker one simple, devastating directive. I wanted them to tear Wyatt's entire technology startup down to its fundamental digital foundation. I wanted every hidden server breached, every deleted email recovered, and every falsified accounting ledger ripped wide open for my personal inspection. The cybersecurity syndicate worked with terrifying surgical speed. Sitting in the cold, dimly lit warehouse, I watched endless strings of encrypted code and highly classified financial spreadsheets flood my laptop screen. Wyatt had always projected the flawless image of a visionary tech chief executive officer. He spent his time bragging at exclusive country club dinners about his revolutionary data aggregation algorithms and massive venture capital backing. The absolute truth laid bare in the raw financial data downloading before my eyes was profoundly pathetic. His company was a hollow, crumbling shell. The hackers effortlessly bypassed Wyatt's amateur commercial firewalls, digging straight into the primary accounting mainframes and internal communication networks. The digital ledger was a chaotic, desperate mess of inflated revenue projections, forged investor portfolios, and fabricated user engagement metrics. But I was not looking for petty corporate fraud to hand over to the authorities. I was looking for the $5 million cartel debt Kendra had promised to repay with my execution. The lead hacker isolated a series of highly obfuscated transactions routed through a complex maze of dummy corporations over the past 14 months. Wyatt had systematically drained his own company's legitimate operating capital to cover his massive illicit borrowing. He had meticulously falsified the quarterly expense reports, categorizing the missing millions as aggressive research and development losses. He was desperately trying to balance the books before his board of directors initiated a routine end-of-year audit. I scrutinized the flowing data matrices, my eyes narrowing as I processed the columns of outgoing wire transfers. Something in the structural flow of the money was fundamentally wrong. I had spent 40 years analyzing complex financial structures and hostile acquisitions. I knew exactly how desperate men moved stolen capital to cover their tracks. Wyatt's accounting did not reflect a man throwing money into a sinking business to save his reputation, nor did it reflect a man paying off aggressive black market loan sharks. The math was entirely disjointed. The $5 million had not evaporated into failed tech investments, nor had it been transferred to any known cartel laundering accounts in South America. I typed a rapid, demanding command to the lead hacker, instructing him to trace the exact exit nodes of the missing capital regardless of the encryption blocking the path. The screen paused for a fraction of a second as the syndicate deployed aggressive tracking algorithms to pierce the final layer of Wyatt's digital camouflage. A new, highly secured routing pathway materialized on my display, illuminating the true destination of the funds. The hacker sent a direct encrypted message alongside the data block, confirming my darkest suspicions. The $5 million was not lost in the volatile tech market. It had never been paid to the cartel to settle his massive debts either. The entire massive sum had been intentionally and systematically siphoned out of the tech startup in small, untraceable increments over a grueling 12-month period. The destination was not a corporate vendor or a ruthless black market creditor. The money had been routed directly into a heavily fortified, ghost offshore shell company located in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands shell company was a digital fortress. My lead hacker sent a harsh, rapid-fire message across the encrypted channel explaining that the offshore routing node was protected by military-grade cryptographic firewalls. It was not a standard corporate security measure. This was black market infrastructure explicitly designed to vaporize all data logs the moment a brute-force digital assault was detected. I could not simply order my syndicate to smash through the defenses. If the servers initiated a self-destruct protocol, the ultimate proof of the stolen $5 million would be permanently erased. I needed the specific alphanumeric ownership records of that shell company to legally prove the massive fraud and trace the true destination of the cartel funds. Without those exact names and account registries, I had nothing but circumstantial anomalies on a spreadsheet. Wyatt was an incompetent fool, but whoever set up this specific offshore sanctuary was a paranoid professional. I stared at the glowing lines of code on my laptop screen, my mind calculating the necessary logistics of a physical breach. To quietly slip past a military-grade encryption wall without triggering the automated tripwires, I needed root access. I needed an inside man with legacy administrative privileges embedded deep within the architecture of Wyatt's tech startup. I knew Wyatt was entirely too arrogant to build his own foundational code. He had outsourced the heavy lifting during the early days of his company. I pulled up the initial incorporation documents of Wyatt's business from my own meticulously kept financial archives. There was only one man who possessed the raw technical capability and the foundational server access to bypass this specific level of security without sounding the alarm. His name was Gavin. He was a brilliant, reclusive software engineer who co-founded the tech startup alongside my son-in-law exactly 4 years ago. Gavin was the actual architect behind the data aggregation algorithms that Wyatt so proudly paraded at his wealthy country club dinners. But Gavin was no longer an executive. A year ago, Wyatt orchestrated a ruthless internal corporate coup. My son-in-law quietly fabricated a trail of digital evidence successfully framing his own partner for severe corporate embezzlement. Wyatt aggressively forced Gavin out of the company, seizing his entire equity stake and threatening him with federal prosecution if he dared to fight the severance terms. Gavin was left utterly broke, stripped of his life's work, and legally silenced by a mountain of predatory non-disclosure agreements. I knew the man was currently rotting in the bleak industrial outskirts of the city, nursing a bottomless well of resentment. I locked down the manager's office, ensuring Leo remained safely asleep and the perimeter alarms were active. I stepped back out into the freezing pre-dawn darkness and slid into the driver's seat of the battered silver Honda. I did not have time to play the diplomat. I drove straight into the decayed, neon-lit commercial district near the shipping yards. Gavin had practically taken up permanent residence at a notorious windowless dive bar that catered to washed-up dock workers and ruined businessmen. He was exactly where my private investigator had noted in a background check 6 months ago. I pushed through the heavy rusted metal doors of the tavern. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer and cheap tobacco. I spotted him instantly slouched over a sticky wooden table in the darkest corner of the room. I walked across the sticky linoleum floor and slid into the cracked leather booth directly across from him. Gavin looked up from his half-empty glass of cheap whiskey. He was pale, severely unkempt, and carrying the heavy, exhausted posture of a man who had lost everything. He recognized me instantly. The color drained completely from his haggard face. "Alton Reed," he stammered instinctively, pushing his glass away. "You are supposed to be locked up. It is all over the news." I ignored his panic and placed a thick sealed manila envelope on the table between us. "I do not have the patience for small talk, Gavin," I said, my voice barely rising above the low hum of the bar's neon signs. "I know Wyatt framed you for embezzlement a year ago. I know he stole your company. I also know that a paranoid engineer like you never walks away from a hostile exit without maintaining a hidden back door into the servers you built. I need your retained administrative encryption keys to Wyatt's private networks right now." Gavin swallowed hard, shaking his head frantically. "You are out of your mind. If Wyatt catches me breaching his servers, he will trigger the embezzlement charges. I am not going to federal prison for you." I leaned forward, trapping his gaze with absolute unyielding authority. "You are already going to federal prison, Gavin. Wyatt is currently drowning in a $5 million debt to a highly violent cartel. He used the foundational routing architecture you designed to siphon those illicit funds into an offshore shell company. When the federal investigators inevitably tear his company apart, they will trace the money laundering directly back to the original source code. Wyatt will testify under oath that you set up the offshore nodes before you were fired." I slid the manila envelope an inch closer to his trembling hands. "I am offering you a brutal singular choice. You can hand over the encryption keys to me right now and I will personally ensure Wyatt takes the entire fall. Or you can refuse and I will personally deliver the digital logs linking your foundational code to the cartel money laundering directly to the FBI before sunrise." Gavin stared at me, visibly suffocating under the crushing weight of the ultimatum. He reached into his heavy jacket with shaking fingers and pulled out a small encrypted titanium flash drive. He slid it across the sticky table. I secured the titanium flash drive inside my coat pocket, the metallic weight providing a profound sense of tactical advantage. I had the ultimate key to obliterate their digital fortress. I stood up from the booth, ready to return to the warehouse and initiate the final phase of the financial assault. As I turned toward the exit, the volume on the small static-filled television mounted above the bar suddenly spiked. The bartender grabbed the remote, his eyes glued to the screen. I froze in my tracks. A live breaking news broadcast illuminated the dim tavern. My daughter Kendra was standing at a podium surrounded by dozens of flashing cameras and solemn police officers. She looked devastatingly fragile. Tears streamed perfectly down her carefully made-up face as she clutched a framed photograph of Leo to her chest. "My father is dangerously insane," she sobbed into the cluster of microphones, her voice trembling with a masterful performance of sheer maternal agony. "He has violently abducted my little boy. Please, if anyone sees him, help me bring my son home before he does something unthinkable." I watched the patrons in the bar slowly turn their heads from the television screen directly toward me, their expressions shifting from drunken apathy to violent, aggressive recognition. I did not wait for the drunken patrons of the dive bar to process what they were seeing on the television screen. The moment their eyes shifted from Kendra's sobbing face to my silhouette, I moved. I grabbed a handful of crumpled $20 bills from my pocket and threw them directly into the air toward the bar counter. The sudden scatter of cash created a split second of chaotic distraction. Men scrambled for the money, and I pushed through the rusted metal doors, disappearing into the freezing night. I was no longer just a wealthy grandfather fighting a family dispute. Thanks to my daughter's flawless televised performance, I was officially public enemy number one. Every police officer, ambitious civilian, and opportunistic bounty hunter in the state was now actively looking for the dangerously insane man who abducted his own grandson. I sprinted to the silver Honda and tore out of the industrial district, taking a convoluted route of abandoned service roads to ensure absolutely no one was tailing me. I reached the condemned warehouse and pulled the vehicle inside, dropping the heavy rolling steel door shut. I immediately locked down the entire perimeter, engaging the physical deadbolts and motion sensors. Jonathan, my corporate lawyer, had arrived during my absence, slipping in through the secure underground service entrance. He was pacing the concrete floor, his expensive suit wrinkled, looking terrified. I ignored his panic. I checked on Leo, who was sleeping peacefully in the locked manager's office, and then walked over to the makeshift command center we had established on a folding table. The encrypted laptop was glowing brightly in the dark room. The underground cybersecurity syndicate I hired was online and waiting for my command. I sat down next to Jonathan, pulled the titanium flash drive from my coat, and prepared to draw first blood. I inserted Gavin's titanium flash drive into the secure port of the laptop. The lead hacker on the dark web proxy received the administrative encryption keys instantly. The digital fortress that Wyatt had paid millions to secure dissolved in a matter of seconds. The military-grade firewalls protecting his tech startup's internal servers recognized the legacy credentials and parted without triggering a single internal alarm. We were inside the belly of his corporate infrastructure. I stared at the raw financial dashboards reflecting his legitimate operating capital. Wyatt had approximately $8 million sitting in diverse corporate holding accounts, money meant for payroll, server maintenance, and investor dividends. To the untrained eye, taking that money would seem like the ultimate victory. But I am not an amateur thief. During my 40-year reign in commercial real estate development, I navigated the most brutal regulatory environments on the planet. I survived aggressive hostile takeovers, relentless corporate espionage, and exhaustive federal audits. I know the Securities and Exchange Commission regulations inside and out. I know exactly how federal financial oversight agencies operate, how their automated tripwires function, and what specific actions trigger an immediate lethal response from the United States government. Stealing the money would make me a common criminal and give Wyatt a legal avenue to claim he was the victim of a massive cyber theft, allowing his insurance to eventually bail him out. I did not want to steal from him. I wanted to weaponize the federal government against him. I wanted to turn the full crushing weight of the Internal Revenue Service directly onto his fragile, fraudulent operation. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my hands resting on the keyboard. I gave the lead hacker a precise, devastating sequence of commands. We selected every single active corporate account tied to Wyatt's tech startup. I watched the green numbers on the dashboard representing his entire legitimate operating capital, $8,400,000. I instructed the syndicate to initiate a massive simultaneous wire transfer of every cent. But we did not route the funds to a hidden offshore account or a decentralized cryptocurrency wallet. We routed the entire $8 million directly into the payment portals of the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission. We officially tagged the massive multi-million-dollar transfers with specific heavily red-flagged accounting codes. We labeled the wires as anonymous back tax payments and corporate penalty settlements for fraudulent foreign investments. The digital execution was flawless and instantaneous. I watched the numbers on Wyatt's corporate dashboards plummet from millions down to absolute zero in the blink of an eye. This specific action was a financial death sentence. By forcing his company to voluntarily pay $8 million in sudden, unexplained back taxes, I triggered an unavoidable, catastrophic automated response within the federal banking system. The IRS algorithms would instantly freeze every remaining asset tied to his name pending a massive federal investigation. His payroll checks would bounce in the morning. His investors would receive automatic delinquency notices. His server hosting companies would terminate his contracts for non-payment. Wyatt's business was now entirely dead in the water, and he was officially on the radar of the most ruthless financial investigators in the federal government. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the zeros on the screen. Jonathan stood beside me, his jaw clenched in absolute shock as he realized the sheer magnitude of the corporate sabotage I had just executed. I did not just drain Wyatt's bank accounts. I legally destroyed his entire professional existence in less than 3 minutes. Miles away inside the opulent master bedroom of the mansion, Wyatt's personal smartphone erupted with a relentless barrage of catastrophic banking alerts. Urgent push notifications from his chief financial officer, automated fraud warnings from his corporate banking institutions, and federal freeze notices lit up his screen simultaneously. His legitimate accounts were completely zeroed out. In a state of sheer suffocating panic, Wyatt realized his company was destroyed and the federal authorities were closing in. Desperate to understand how his impenetrable network collapsed, he immediately contacted a black hat tracker on his payroll. He demanded a trace on the massive data transfer. Despite my syndicate's heavy proxy rotation, the unprecedented volume of the transaction created a momentary microscopic digital footprint. The tracker successfully isolated the raw Internet Protocol address ping, tracing the geographical origin of the hack directly back to the abandoned industrial district. Wyatt received the exact coordinates of my condemned warehouse. He did not dial 911 to alert the police, knowing his own massive fraud was about to be exposed. Instead, driven by absolute desperation and rage, he made a fatal decision. He contacted the ruthless cartel enforcers he owed $5 million to give them my exact location and dispatched them to the warehouse to execute me. The sharp crunch of heavy tires on loose gravel echoed through the cavernous space of the condemned warehouse. I immediately killed the power to my encrypted laptop, plunging our makeshift command center into absolute darkness. I moved to the reinforced manager's office window and peered through the rusted iron grates. 4 matte black tactical vehicles had violently breached the outer perimeter, their high beams slicing through the freezing fog. A dozen heavily armed men poured out of the vehicles, moving with terrifying silent efficiency. They carried suppressed assault rifles and heavy breaching tools. Wyatt had actually done it. In a blind panic over his decimated corporate accounts, my son-in-law had surrendered my exact coordinates to the ruthless cartel enforcers he owed $5 million. Jonathan backed away from the steel-reinforced loading doors, his face pale, his expensive suit trembling along with his entire body. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that corporate litigation tactics meant absolutely nothing against a heavily armed hit squad. Inside the locked manager's office, Leo was still sleeping soundly under my thick wool coat, completely oblivious to the lethal threat closing in around us. The enforcers did not waste time shouting demands or negotiating. A massive, deafening metallic crash vibrated through the concrete floor as they slammed a heavy kinetic battering ram against the primary steel rolling doors. The thick steel hinges groaned, buckling under the immense concentrated force of the assault. They were less than 2 minutes away from breaching the interior and executing everyone inside. I had spent 40 years building an empire, and I was not about to let a squad of hired thugs murder my grandson in a rusted, abandoned building. I stepped away from the buckling steel doors and moved swiftly to the heavy duffel bag I had brought from my hidden floor safe. Jonathan fell to his knees, mumbling a frantic prayer, completely paralyzed by the impending breach. I ignored him entirely. Decades ago, when I was aggressively expanding my real estate empire into highly volatile, unregulated urban territories, I had to deal with ruthless local syndicates and private security contractors. I learned a fundamental universal truth about hired guns. Mercenaries do not operate on loyalty, honor, or personal vendettas. They operate strictly on profit margins. These cartel enforcers did not care about Wyatt or his failing tech startup. They only cared about recovering the massive debt their boss was owed, and Wyatt had just proven he was entirely incapable of paying them back. I reached deep into the duffel bag and pulled out the remaining stacks of untraceable bearer bonds. I had exactly $200,000 in pure, liquid capital wrapped tightly in heavy plastic bands. It was not the $5 million Wyatt owed, but it was immediate tangible wealth sitting right in front of them. The heavy steel rolling doors bowed violently inward as another massive strike from the battering ram echoed through the warehouse. The primary locking mechanism snapped the thick iron bolts, tearing away from the concrete frame. The enforcers readied their suppressed weapons, preparing to flood the warehouse floor and eliminate the targets Wyatt had promised them. I walked directly toward the failing entrance, gripping the stacks of bearer bonds. I did not carry a weapon. I carried the only currency that heavily armed assassins truly respected. I stopped 2 feet away from the dented steel door, taking a deep breath to project absolute unwavering authority. I dropped to one knee and forcefully slid the thick packages of bearer bonds through the narrow rusted gap beneath the buckling steel door. The heavy thud of the battering ram abruptly ceased. I could hear the tactical boots shifting on the gravel outside as the enforcers noticed the massive stacks of high-denomination bonds resting near their feet. I stood up, squared my shoulders, and projected my voice with the commanding lethal resonance of a man who controls entire city blocks. "Listen to me very carefully," I shouted through the reinforced steel. "You are holding $200,000 in untraceable bearer bonds. That is a down payment for your time tonight. Wyatt Mitchell sent you here to execute me, but he lied to you. He is completely penniless. I just personally drained his entire corporate infrastructure. As of 10 minutes ago, the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission seized every single asset he possesses. He does not have your $5 million, and he never will." A tense, heavy silence fell over the other side of the door. I knew they were listening. I knew they were calculating the risk versus the immediate reward I had just handed them. "Wyatt did not send you here to collect a debt." I continued, my voice sharp and ruthless. "He sent you here to trigger a massive federal trap. He knew I hacked his accounts. He knew the FBI and federal financial investigators are actively monitoring this exact location right now. If you breach this building and pull those triggers, you will be walking directly into a federal raid. Wyatt set you up to take the fall for his massive money laundering operation so he can cut a plea deal with the government." A low, rapid murmur of voices drifted through the steel door. The squad leader was assessing the bearer bonds and weighing the distinct possibility of a federal ambush. "Mercenaries do not risk federal prison sentences for a bankrupt client. Take the $200,000, I commanded firmly. "Walk away right now. Tell your boss that Wyatt Mitchell burned you, and let me handle the man who stole your money. You get paid, you avoid the FBI, and your ledger gets settled." The silence stretched for another agonizing 10 seconds before I heard the distinct heavy sound of the bearer bonds being scooped off the gravel. They took the money, but professional hitmen never leave a clean trail. The squad leader shouted a sharp command in Spanish. A second later, the heavy clatter of metallic objects bounced against the concrete floor inside the warehouse. They had dropped 3 military-grade incendiary grenades through the gap beneath the door to cover their tracks. The grenades detonated instantly, spewing blinding white-hot chemical flames that aggressively devoured the wooden pallets and drywall. The warehouse erupted into a blazing inferno within seconds. I sprinted back to the manager's office, kicking the door open. I grabbed a terrified Leo and dragged the paralyzed Jonathan by his collar. I knew the architectural layout of this condemned property flawlessly. I kicked away a rusted metal grate hidden beneath a stack of old tires, revealing a subterranean municipal storm drain. We plunged into the dark, freezing water of the tunnel just as the roof of the warehouse collapsed under the intense heat. We crawled through the toxic sludge for nearly a mile, guided only by the faint light of the street grates above. By dawn, we emerged in a deserted drainage ditch on the outskirts of the city. We stood freezing in the mud, listening to a discarded radio outside a convenience store. The morning news anchor announced that the suspected kidnapper, Alton Reed, had officially perished in a massive industrial warehouse fire. The freezing mud of the drainage ditch clung to our clothes as we listened to the radio broadcast confirm my fiery demise. The world believed Alton Reed was nothing more than ashes inside a collapsed industrial warehouse. To an ordinary man, losing his identity would be a tragedy. To me, it was the greatest tactical advantage I had possessed since this nightmare began. A dead man cannot be served with an arrest warrant. A dead man cannot be involuntarily committed to a psychiatric ward. Most importantly, a dead man is entirely invisible to his enemies. I turned off the cheap radio and looked at Jonathan, who was shivering violently in his ruined designer suit, staring blankly at the muddy water. I instructed him to gather himself immediately. We walked to a nearby strip mall where I used a fraction of the remaining bearer bonds to purchase clean clothes, prepaid cellular devices, and a hot meal for Leo. My grandson was exhausted, but the silent resilience in his small eyes reminded me exactly why I was fighting this war. I hailed a private transport service using a massive cash bribe and directed the driver to a discreet high-end hotel on the opposite side of the city. Decades of ruthless corporate espionage had taught me the absolute value of maintaining secure aliases. I booked the penthouse suite under a deeply buried corporate identity that neither Wyatt nor Kendra knew existed. The heavy oak doors of the suite locked behind us, sealing us inside a luxurious, impenetrable fortress. I ordered room service for Leo, ensuring he had a warm bed and absolute safety. I instructed Jonathan to set up our new digital command center on the dining room table. We were officially ghosts, and ghosts have the unique ability to strike without warning. With the morning news cycles continuously looping the dramatic footage of the burning warehouse, my daughter and her husband wasted absolutely no time playing the role of the grieving family. By noon, Jonathan intercepted a digital filing through his law firm's automated registry. Wyatt and Kendra had formally submitted the claim for the $10 million corporate life insurance policy. They invoked the double indemnity clause, asserting that my death was a direct result of a tragic accident while I was suffering from severe mental decline. They expected an immediate frictionless payout to settle their mounting cartel debts and secure their stolen wealth. They were severely mistaken. During my tenure expanding my commercial real estate empire, I mandated strict clauses within all my high-level corporate insurance policies to prevent exactly this kind of predatory liquidation. The underwriters required a mandatory 72-hour investigative review period for any accidental death claim exceeding $5 million. The funds would sit frozen in a legal escrow account, while the insurance adjusters verified the police reports, reviewed the fire marshal assessments, and conducted a thorough background check. That 72-hour window was a catastrophic delay for Wyatt, who was actively being hunted by cartel enforcers, expecting their money by Friday. But for me, that tiny window of bureaucratic delay was an absolute gift. It gave me the exact amount of time I needed to completely dismantle the foundation of their operation before a single dollar was transferred into their greedy hands. I sat at the hotel dining table drinking black coffee and reconnected with my underground cybersecurity syndicate. We had a strict, unforgiving deadline. We needed to expose the offshore shell company and trace the missing $5 million before the insurance company authorized the payout. The television in the hotel suite broadcasted the local news updates continuously. I watched with clinical detachment as Kendra organized an incredibly lavish, highly publicized memorial service in the center of the city. She stood at a podium draped in black designer fabrics, weeping beautifully for the cameras. She spoke eloquently about her deep love for her departed father and the tragic illness that had claimed my mind before the fire took my life. She played the devastated daughter with Oscar-worthy precision, wiping away non-existent tears while accepting condolences from the city's wealthy elite. Wyatt stood solemnly by her side, looking appropriately devastated, though I knew he was internally suffocating from the pressure of the cartel's impending deadline. While they performed their pathetic pantomime of grief on live television, my cybersecurity syndicate was relentlessly battering the final layer of the Cayman Islands' offshore firewall. The hackers utilized the administrative encryption keys I had extracted from Gavin, navigating the complex digital labyrinth that hid the stolen cartel funds. It was a grueling, highly technical assault. The shell company was defended by black market cryptographic algorithms explicitly designed to wipe the servers clean upon detection. I paced the length of the hotel suite, watching the complex lines of code cascade across my laptop screen. The tension in the room was palpable as Jonathan watched the progress bar inch forward. The lead hacker sent a rapid, triumphant message through the encrypted proxy. They had successfully bypassed the self-destruct protocol. The offshore firewall was officially cracked. The digital vault swung open, spilling its highly classified secrets directly onto my monitor. We immediately traced the precise routing history of the $5 million cartel loan. The raw data confirmed the money had been systematically siphoned from Wyatt's failing tech startup and funneled directly into this hidden, untraceable sanctuary. The capital was sitting there entirely untouched, accumulating interest and waiting to be accessed. I instructed the syndicate to extract the primary ownership documents immediately. I needed the exact name registered to the shell company to prove Wyatt was laundering cartel money and send him to federal prison. The heavily encrypted file containing the master registry finally downloaded onto my secure hard drive. I opened the digital document, fully expecting to see Wyatt's signature scattered across the corporate registration forms. I was preparing to package the irrefutable proof of his massive money laundering operation and send it directly to the federal authorities to ensure his permanent incarceration. I scrolled down past the complex banking codes and proxy addresses to reach the primary beneficiary and sole ownership designation section at the bottom of the ledger. The blood in my veins turned instantly to ice. I stopped breathing. The name legally registered on the offshore account did not belong to my son-in-law. Wyatt had absolutely no legal authority, no access codes, and no connection whatsoever to this hidden digital vault. The meticulously crafted shell company, the $5 million in stolen cartel capital, and the entire masterfully orchestrated financial trap belonged exclusively to one person. The bold, undeniable signature executed on the bottom of the registration form was Kendra Mitchell. She owned every single cent. My daughter was the sole ruthless architect of this empire of deceit. The absolute scale of her malevolence paralyzed the room. I sat back in my chair, my eyes tracing the digital signatures verifying Kendra's complete ownership of the Cayman Islands Shell Company. Wyatt was not a criminal mastermind. He was a pathetic, incompetent shield. Kendra had orchestrated the entire cartel debt from the very beginning. She allowed her desperate husband to take out the lethal loans to prop up his failing tech startup, but she systematically siphoned every single cent of that illicit capital into her own private offshore vault. She intentionally pushed him into an insurmountable debt with violent black market enforcers, knowing they would eventually come to collect their due. Her master plan was a masterpiece of pure sociopathy. She intended to have me murdered during the fake psychiatric transport to secure the $10 million double indemnity insurance payout. Once that clean, legitimate money was safely transferred into her accounts, she would simply sit back and let the ruthless cartel mercenaries murder Wyatt for defaulting on the $5 million debt. She would play the devastated, grieving widow, inheriting whatever scraps remained of his company, completely insulated from any legal or criminal blowback. With her husband permanently silenced by the cartel and her father burned to ashes, in an industrial fire she would walk away with $15 million in pure, untraceable profit. She was actively planning to execute her entire family and flee the country as a wealthy, blameless victim. The sheer chilling perfection of her strategy left Jonathan gasping for air beside me. He looked at the glowing screen, then at me, realizing the woman crying on national television was an absolute monster. I stared unblinking at the computer screen. In that exact moment, the final lingering fragment of parental affection I harbored for my daughter completely evaporated. The father who had carried her on his shoulders, who had paid for her elite education, who had desperately tried to protect her from the harsh realities of the world, died right there in that silent hotel suite. In his place, the ruthless, calculating tycoon who had dominated the commercial real estate market for 4 decades took absolute control. 30 years ago, a corrupt syndicate of building contractors attempted to embezzle millions from my foundational development projects in the inner city. I did not take them to court. I systematically dismantled their supply chains, bought out their outstanding debts, and liquidated their assets until their leaders were begging for bankruptcy. I built my empire on a fundamental, unforgiving principle. You do not show mercy to those who attempt to steal what you have built. If you allow betrayal to go unpunished, you invite wolves directly to your front door. I had applied this ruthless doctrine to aggressive competitors, corrupt politicians, and predatory investors throughout my entire career. Now I was forced to apply the exact same doctrine to my own flesh and blood. Kendra wanted to play the high-stakes game of corporate assassination. I was going to show her exactly why I had never lost a war. I reached across the table, grabbed my encrypted laptop, and pulled the keyboard close to my chest. I did not feel sorrow. I did not feel grief. I felt a cold, mechanical clarity. I looked at the lead hacker's active chat window on the dark web proxy and typed out my final set of destructive commands. I instructed the cybersecurity syndicate to bypass all standard withdrawal protocols. We were not going to freeze Kendra's hidden assets or alert international banking authorities to her massive fraud. We were going to commit a hostile digital extraction. I authorized the hackers to forcibly drain the Cayman Islands offshore account down to the absolute last cent. I watched the loading progress bar inch across my screen as the syndicate aggressively bypassed her secondary security walls. The massive sum of $5 million, the exact amount Wyatt owed to the underground lenders, was immediately liquidated from her private vault. But I did not take the money for myself. I commanded the hackers to route the entire stolen sum through a series of untraceable digital tumblers, effectively washing the capital clean of any banking restrictions. Then I gave them the exact routing numbers for the cartel boss. My private investigator had already acquired the black market financial channels these enforcers used to launder their street revenue. I ordered the hackers to wire the $5 million directly into the cartel's primary holding account. The transaction was completely anonymous, but I ensured it came with a highly specific, undeniable digital package. I attached the unencrypted transaction logs, the offshore ownership registries featuring Kendra's verified signature, and the exact timestamps showing when she transferred the cartel's money into her own private sanctuary. I provided the ruthless criminals with irrefutable proof that Wyatt was just a blind, desperate pawn. Kendra was the one who had intentionally stolen their capital and hid it for her own personal gain. I pressed the enter key with a heavy, deliberate strike. The massive wire transfer deployed instantly. The screen flashed a bright green confirmation message. The $5 million landed squarely in the cartel's possession, accompanied by a digital dossier that painted a massive lethal target directly onto my daughter's back. I leaned back in my chair, closing the laptop completely. The financial execution was officially finished. Miles away inside the heavily fortified walls of the sprawling mansion, the illusion of Kendra's victory began to crumble. Pacing the hardwood floor of her luxurious master suite, she felt the walls closing in as public scrutiny and police investigations intensified around her husband. Deciding it was time to abandon Wyatt to his inevitable fate, she opened her encrypted tablet to secure her immediate escape. She logged into a high-end aviation charter service, preparing to wire a massive deposit to secure a private jet bound for a non-extradition country in South America. She confidently entered her offshore banking credentials and initiated the transfer. The screen buffered for a fraction of a second before flashing a stark, glaring error message. Transaction declined. Zero balance. Kendra froze her breath, catching violently in her throat. Frantically, she refreshed the primary dashboard of her Cayman Islands account. The vault was completely empty. A secondary automated alert popped up on her screen, notifying her that the entire $5 million had been forcefully routed to a known cartel account along with her personal identification logs. The color drained from her face as sheer, suffocating terror took hold. She realized her money was gone and the cartel knew exactly who had tried to rob them. Kendra screamed a guttural sound of pure, unadulterated terror that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the master suite. She hurled the encrypted tablet against the marble fireplace, shattering the screen into 1,000 useless pieces. Her perfect, calculated world had just collapsed entirely. She stormed down the sweeping carpeted staircase, her manicured hands trembling with a violent rage. She found Wyatt pacing frantically in the massive formal living room. His face was the color of dirty ash. He was clutching his own phone, desperately trying to comprehend why the federal government had just seized every legitimate asset tied to his tech company. Before he could even utter a word of his own catastrophic financial ruin, Kendra launched herself at him. "You stole it!" she shrieked, driving her perfectly manicured nails directly into the expensive fabric of his tailored suit jacket. "You found the offshore routing numbers, and you drained my vault." Wyatt stumbled backward, completely blindsided by the physical assault. He grabbed her wrists, shoving her aggressively away. "What are you talking about?" he roared, his voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered panic. "The Internal Revenue Service just froze my entire company. I do not have a single dollar to my name. The cartel is going to kill me by Friday, Kendra. You hid the $5 million," she accused, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. "You found the Cayman registry and you took it to save your own pathetic life." Wyatt stared at her genuine confusion mixing with absolute dread. He knew nothing about a Cayman Islands registry. He knew nothing about her private vault. He only knew that the violent men he owed $5 million were going to skin him alive, and his wife was suddenly ranting about hidden offshore accounts. "You stole their money." Wyatt breathed out, the horrific realization slowly settling over his features. "You had the cartel capital the entire time, and you hid it from me." The fragile, carefully constructed illusion of their high society marriage instantly vaporized into the cold air of the living room. There was no love between them. There had never been any genuine affection. 5 years ago, when they stood at the altar exchanging vows, they were not binding their hearts together. They were executing a mutual, highly lucrative corporate merger. Wyatt needed the prestige and immense financial backing of the Alton Reed commercial real estate empire to legitimize his struggling tech startup. Kendra needed a compliant, ambitious husband who looked perfect in country club photographs, but was weak enough for her to entirely control behind closed doors. Their entire relationship was predicated entirely on the continuous, uninterrupted flow of massive wealth. Without the insulating layer of multi-million-dollar bank accounts, luxury vehicles, and private estates, they immediately reverted to their most primal, vicious instincts. Like rabid animals trapped inside an opulent cage, they turned on each other with absolute savagery. Kendra grabbed a heavy, solid crystal whiskey decanter from the mahogany side table and hurled it directly at Wyatt's head. He ducked just in time. The expensive crystal smashed against the custom drywall, showering the Persian rug with jagged shards and expensive liquor. "You are a weak, incompetent failure," Kendra screamed, her voice echoing through the massive empty house. "I had to orchestrate this entire operation because you were too stupid to manage a simple tech company without borrowing from violent criminals." Wyatt lunged forward, kicking a velvet armchair out of his path. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her violently. "I am a dead man because of you." He spat his face inches from hers. "The cartel does not negotiate, Kendra. They are going to butcher me, and when they find out you had their money, they are going to butcher you next." They stood amidst the shattered glass of their luxurious life, breathing heavily, completely consumed by the terrifying reality of their impending executions. In the stifling silence that followed their violent outburst, a sharp, simultaneous electronic chime pierced the air. Wyatt's smartphone vibrated aggressively inside his suit pocket. A split second later, Kendra's backup cell phone resting on the nearby console table buzzed with the exact same notification tone. They both froze. The synchronized digital alert felt like a deliberate, ominous warning. Wyatt slowly reached into his jacket, pulling out his device with trembling fingers. Kendra moved cautiously to the console table, her eyes darting suspiciously toward the glowing screen. The incoming text message displayed a contact name that made the blood freeze solidly in their veins. The sender identification read simply, Alton Reed. The man they believed had burned to ashes inside a condemned industrial warehouse just 24 hours ago was actively transmitting a signal directly into their highly secured mansion. Wyatt swiped his trembling thumb across the cracked glass of his screen, opening the encrypted message. It was not a long, dramatic declaration. It was 3 concise, brutally efficient sentences delivered with the lethal precision of a corporate executioner. "I am alive, your accounts are empty, and the cartel knows exactly where you live." The words hit Wyatt like a physical hollow-point bullet tearing through his chest. The entire massive, elaborate conspiracy he had built instantly collapsed. His father-in-law was not a helpless victim suffering from violent dementia. He was a ruthless, calculating ghost who had systematically dismantled their lives from the shadows. Alton had not just survived the fiery assault by the cartel enforcers, he had orchestrated the complete federal seizure of Wyatt's tech company. He had drained Kendra's hidden offshore sanctuary. He had weaponized the stolen $5 million and returned it to the dangerous men who owned the debt, providing them with the exact digital evidence required to prove Kendra and Wyatt were the ones who intentionally attempted to steal it. The realization struck them both simultaneously. They had tried to play a high-stakes game of corporate assassination against a man who had spent 4 decades crushing his enemies without a shred of mercy. The message was not a threat. It was a formal notification of their impending doom. They were completely isolated, financially ruined, and actively being hunted by heavily armed assassins who now possessed their exact geographical coordinates. Wyatt looked up from his glowing screen, his eyes wide with a terrifying homicidal clarity. He stared at his wife, finally understanding the absolute depth of her betrayal. "You set me up," he whispered, his voice trembling with pure, unadulterated rage. "You were going to let the cartel murder me, take your father's insurance money, and walk away clean." Wyatt did not wait for her to formulate another lie. He spun around, pulling a heavy loaded handgun from the concealed drawer of his executive writing desk. He racked the slide, pointing the lethal weapon directly at Kendra's chest. "You are going to fix this," he demanded, his finger tightening dangerously on the trigger. "You are going to call them and tell them you acted alone." Kendra did not beg or cower. Her survival instinct overrode any sense of fear. As Wyatt stepped forward to physically grab her, she feigned a stumble. Her hand closed around the thick, heavy base of a solid crystal flower vase resting on the side table. With a vicious, lightning-fast motion, she swung the heavy crystal directly into the side of Wyatt's skull. The brutal impact shattered the vase and sent Wyatt crashing heavily to the hardwood floor, a pool of dark crimson rapidly expanding around his head. Kendra did not look back. She stepped over her bleeding husband, grabbed her car keys, and sprinted into the garage, tearing out into the freezing night in her high-performance sports car. The sleek engine of Kendra's sports car roared as she tore down the empty interstate, pushing the vehicle well past the speed limit. Her hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles were stark white against the darkness. On the passenger seat rested a heavy black duffel bag. It was hastily stuffed with high-value diamond jewelry, solid gold watches, and the remaining bundles of emergency physical cash she kept hidden behind her walk-in closet for a disaster scenario exactly like this one. She was bleeding slightly from a scratch on her cheek where a piece of the shattered crystal vase had grazed her during the violent altercation with Wyatt, but she did not care. Wyatt was bleeding out on the hardwood floor of the mansion, and the cartel assassins were undoubtedly already en route to their address. She had to get out of the country before sunrise. She navigated the sharp, winding roads leading to the private municipal airstrip on the outskirts of the city. This isolated airfield operated outside the rigorous federal oversight of international hubs, catering specifically to wealthy individuals who valued absolute discretion over standard security protocols. The tires of her car screeched loudly as she skidded onto the dark tarmac, cutting the headlights to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. A sleek, twin-engine private jet sat idling near the furthest hangar, its navigation lights blinking softly in the freezing night. Kendra grabbed the heavy duffel bag, abandoned her expensive vehicle right on the asphalt, and sprinted toward the boarding stairs. The biting wind whipped her hair across her face, but she felt a surge of adrenaline. She was going to escape. The charter pilot, a rugged man in a faded leather jacket, stepped out of the cockpit and stood at the top of the metal boarding stairs, looking highly skeptical of his frantic, unexpected passenger. Kendra did not give him the opportunity to ask questions or demand proper flight clearance. She unzipped the duffel bag, pulled out 2 thick stacks of $100 bills, and shoved the heavy cash directly into his chest. She demanded he file a flight plan for a private airstrip in Costa Rica immediately and warned him that any delays would cost him his lucrative tip. The pilot looked at the massive bribe, nodded silently, and disappeared back into the cockpit to initiate the pre-flight sequence. Kendra marched up the stairs, her expensive heels clanking sharply against the metal steps. Stepping inside the luxurious wood-paneled cabin, a wave of profound relief washed over her. Throughout her entire life, Kendra had always operated under one absolute, unshakable conviction. She sincerely believed she was the smartest person in any room, from manipulating her high school teachers to orchestrating complex, illicit financial maneuvers behind her husband's back. She viewed the rest of humanity as gullible pawns waiting to be moved across her personal chessboard. She possessed an arrogant certainty that no matter how catastrophic a situation became, her superior intellect would always guarantee her survival. She dropped the heavy duffel bag onto the plush carpet and let out a long, victorious breath. She had successfully outmaneuvered the local police, abandoned her useless husband to a cartel execution squad, and outsmarted her supposedly brilliant tycoon father. She turned toward the leather passenger seats to secure her seatbelt for takeoff. Kendra froze completely, the victorious smirk instantly vanishing from her face. Sitting perfectly still in the oversized leather captain's chair at the back of the cabin was me. I watched my daughter from the shadows of the dim cabin, lighting my hands, resting calmly on my silver-handled walking cane. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of paternal affection. I gestured toward the empty seat across from me, signaling her to sit down. For the first time in her pampered, calculated life, Kendra looked genuinely paralyzed by fear. She collapsed into the leather seat, staring at me as if I were an apparition summoned straight from the depths of hell. "You are supposed to be dead," she breathed out, her voice a hollow, terrified rasp. I ignored her pathetic display of shock and reached into the breast pocket of my heavy wool coat. I pulled out a thick stack of printed documents and placed them methodically on the polished walnut table separating us. "I am the architect of a commercial real estate empire," I told her, my tone clinical and absolutely devoid of mercy. "I do not burn in accidental fires, and I do not lose my capital to amateur thieves." I slid the first document forward. It was the forged medical injunction she had paid Dr. Aris to sign. Next to it, I placed the offshore transaction logs featuring her verified digital signature, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that she had siphoned the $5 million cartel loan into her private Cayman Islands vault. Finally, I placed the burner phone on the table and hit the play button. The crisp, clear audio of her voice echoed through the silent cabin, coldly promising the cartel boss that she would have his money by Friday once her father was permanently liquidated. I watched her perfectly curated mask shatter into a million irreparable pieces. "You left a trail of digital breadcrumbs wide enough for a blind man to follow," I stated brutally, mentally dismantling her inflated ego step by step. "You thought you could orchestrate a multi-million-dollar corporate assassination, but you are nothing more than a spoiled, arrogant child playing a game she does not understand. I drained your offshore account. I sent the $5 million directly to the cartel, and I provided them with the exact digital registry proving you were the one who stole it. The terrified, trembling victim act vanished from Kendra's face in the blink of an eye. The sheer realization that she had been utterly defeated by the very man she sought to destroy triggered a violent sociopathic shift in her demeanor. Her features contorted into a mask of pure arrogant malice. She leaned forward, slamming her hands aggressively against the walnut table. "You owe me this money," she snarled, her voice dripping with venomous hatred. "You spent 40 years prioritizing your precious real estate empire over my childhood. You bought buildings while I sat alone in a massive empty house. That $20 million insurance payout was my rightful compensation for enduring a lifetime in your shadow." I stared at her, completely unfazed by her pathetic, entitled justification for attempted patricide. "You earned absolutely nothing," I replied coldly. "And tonight you leave with absolutely nothing." Kendra's eyes flashed with a dangerous, lethal desperation. She realized the pilot was isolated in the cockpit and the tarmac outside was completely deserted. She reached swiftly inside the pocket of her designer trench coat and pulled out a heavy, snub-nosed revolver, aiming the steel barrel directly at the center of my chest. The cold steel barrel of the snub-nosed revolver was pointed directly at the center of my chest. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands in surrender. I simply stared at the trembling fingers of the daughter I had raised. Kendra had the weapon, but she possessed absolutely zero trigger discipline. Her knuckles were white, her breathing was erratic, and the heavy metal gun wavered in her manicured hand. She had spent her entire life orchestrating betrayals from the safe, insulated distance of country club dining rooms and encrypted offshore accounts. Pulling a trigger and watching the life drain from a man's eyes required a level of visceral, physical brutality she simply did not possess. I remained perfectly seated in the luxurious leather chair. I gripped the silver handle of my walking cane, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying calm. "You are holding a loaded weapon on a commercial tarmac," I told her, my voice slicing through the tense silence of the cabin. "Pulling that trigger will instantly alert the flight crew, ground control, and local law enforcement. There is no escape route from a murder charge committed inside a chartered jet. You will spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary." Kendra gritted her teeth, her finger tightening dangerously on the trigger mechanism. She was completely cornered, operating on pure, desperate adrenaline. She knew her offshore accounts were empty. She knew the cartel was actively hunting her. "I am not going to prison," she hissed, taking a step closer, the barrel of the gun shaking violently. "I am going to tell the police that the deranged kidnapper who faked his own death broke into this plane and attacked me. I shot you in self-defense." She steadied her grip, her eyes locking onto mine with lethal intent. She was finally preparing to pull the trigger and end my life to secure her freedom. Before Kendra could apply the final fraction of pressure required to discharge the weapon, a deafening metallic crash echoed violently across the quiet municipal airstrip. The heavy steel chain-link security gate at the perimeter of the airfield was brutally torn from its concrete hinges. A massive black heavy-duty pickup truck smashed through the barrier, dragging twisted metal sparks across the freezing asphalt. The vehicle tore onto the active tarmac, its engine roaring with reckless, homicidal fury. It did not head for the terminal. It swerved violently, accelerating directly toward the idling chartered jet. The sudden explosive noise distracted Kendra instantly. She flinched instinctively, lowering the revolver and whipping her head toward the small cabin window to identify the incoming threat. The black truck slammed its heavy brakes, skidding sideways across the tarmac and coming to a violent halt just yards away from the boarding stairs of our aircraft. The driver's side door was kicked open with tremendous force. Wyatt stumbled out onto the pavement. He was a horrifying sight. A deep, jagged gash ran down the side of his head where Kendra had bludgeoned him with the crystal vase. Thick, dark blood soaked the collar of his expensive suit jacket. He had not waited for an ambulance or the police. He had dragged his battered body to his vehicle, completely consumed by an agonizing, blinding thirst for revenge. He had tracked his wife's sports car to the airstrip, realizing she was attempting to flee the country and leave him to face the brutal wrath of the cartel assassins alone. Wyatt staggered toward the metal boarding stairs, leaning heavily against the railing for support. He reached into his blood-stained coat and pulled out a heavy semi-automatic pistol. He aimed the weapon unsteadily up the stairs, his eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. He was no longer the arrogant tech executive attempting to save his failing startup. He was a desperate, dying animal seeking absolute vengeance against the woman who had condemned him to death. The luxurious cabin of the private jet instantly transformed into a deadly combat zone. Kendra screamed in sheer terror as she recognized her bleeding armed husband staggering up the metal boarding stairs. Wyatt did not issue a warning. He did not demand the stolen cartel money. He raised his semi-automatic pistol and fired a blind, erratic shot directly into the aircraft. The deafening crack of the gunshot shattered the silence of the airstrip. The bullet tore through the expensive wood paneling of the cabin doorframe, showering the plush carpet with jagged splinters. Kendra threw herself violently to the floor, taking cover behind the heavy leather captain's chair. Operating on pure survival instinct, she raised her snub-nosed revolver over the edge of the seat and returned fire. Her shot went wildly off target, shattering the glass of a small cabin window, but the explosive noise forced Wyatt to duck and retreat a few steps back down the metal staircase. They were completely fixated on destroying each other, two rabid predators locked in a fatal struggle for survival. They had entirely forgotten about the silent, calculating architect sitting in the shadows. This chaotic, violent distraction was the exact tactical opening I required. I did not cower beneath the tables. I moved with swift, lethal purpose. I gripped the heavy silver handle of my walking cane, using the sturdy oak shaft as a bludgeoning tool. I stepped silently out of the cabin door, looming directly over Wyatt as he blindly reloaded his weapon on the stairs below. He looked up, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute shock as he realized the man he believed was burned to ashes was standing right above him. I did not give him a fraction of a second to raise his weapon. I swung the heavy oak cane downward with maximum bone-crushing velocity. The solid wood connected brutally with the side of Wyatt's right knee. The joint buckled instantly under the immense force. Wyatt let out a guttural scream of agony, his leg collapsing completely. He tumbled backward down the remaining metal steps, crashing heavily onto the cold asphalt of the tarmac. The semi-automatic pistol flew from his grasp, clattering harmlessly away across the runway. I descended the stairs with measured, dominant strides. I placed my heavy leather boot firmly squarely onto his wounded chest, pinning the bleeding, defeated man directly to the freezing ground. The standoff was over. I had neutralized the immediate threat without firing a single shot. The erratic exchange of live gunfire had not gone unnoticed. The violent gunshots echoed across the quiet municipal district, triggering an immediate massive response from local law enforcement. In the distance, a chorus of high-pitched police sirens began to wail, multiplying rapidly and tearing through the dark night. Within seconds, half a dozen heavily armored police cruisers smashed through the ruined security gate, their glaring red and blue emergency lights illuminating the dark tarmac. The vehicles swarmed the idling private jet, boxing us in from every conceivable angle. Heavily armed tactical officers poured out of the cruisers using their vehicle doors for cover. Wyatt, pinned beneath my boot and bleeding profusely onto the asphalt, saw the arriving authorities. In a final desperate attempt to save himself, he pointed a shaking finger directly up at me. "He is alive!" Wyatt screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing over the blaring sirens. "He is the kidnapper!" "That is Alton Reed. He faked his death and tried to murder us." The police officers reacted instantly to the identification of a high-profile, supposedly armed and dangerous fugitive. Dozens of tactical flashlights and laser sights locked onto my position. "Drop the weapon and put your hands in the air right now," the lead officer roared through a megaphone. I stood perfectly still on the tarmac as a dozen bright red laser dots painted the center of my chest. I slowly opened my fingers, allowing the heavy oak cane to clatter onto the freezing asphalt of the runway. I raised my empty hands into the cold night air, offering absolutely no physical resistance. Tactical officers swarmed me instantly, moving with excessive performative brutality for the benefit of their superiors. Rough hands shoved me violently against the cold steel exterior of an armored cruiser. Heavy metal handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around my wrists, biting deeply into my aging skin with punishing force. I was thoroughly searched, stripped of my heavy wool coat, and shoved aggressively into the cramped, caged backseat of a patrol car. The ride to the local precinct was a disorienting blur of flashing red and blue lights and wailing sirens tearing through the quiet municipal district. I did not speak to the transporting officers. I simply watched the city I had helped build roll past the reinforced windows, my mind calculating the next necessary legal maneuver. At the station, the standard formalities of booking were entirely bypassed. I was not taken to a holding cell, nor was I offered my legally mandated phone call. I was dragged roughly down a dimly lit, narrow corridor and shoved directly into a windowless concrete interrogation room. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind me, the deadbolt engaging with a loud, absolute finality. The room was explicitly designed for psychological submission. The air conditioning blasted at a freezing temperature to weaken resolve. A single harsh fluorescent bulb buzzed aggressively overhead, casting deep shadows across a scratched metal table. I was forcibly seated and shackled to a heavy iron ring embedded in the floor. I sat perfectly upright, squaring my shoulders, adjusting to the chill. I knew exactly what was happening. This was a staged environment. The heavy steel door groaned open. A thick-set detective with a rumpled suit and a perpetually sweating brow stepped into the interrogation room. He tossed a thick manila folder onto the scratched metal table with a loud theatrical slap designed to startle me. I recognized his face instantly from the deep background checks my private investigators ran on Wyatt years ago. This was Detective Vance, a notoriously corrupt local investigator who moonlighted as a brutal fixer for affluent, desperate executives. He was firmly embedded on Wyatt's payroll. Vance did not introduce himself, and he certainly did not read me my Miranda rights. He leaned across the table, reeking of stale coffee and cheap cologne invading my personal space. He slid a perfectly typed, multi-page document toward my shackled hands. It was a pre-written, comprehensive confession. The document explicitly detailed that I suffered a severe psychotic break, deliberately kidnapped my grandson, set fire to a commercial warehouse to fake my own death, and violently attacked my daughter at the airstrip. All Vance needed was my signature to legally seal my fate and validate Wyatt's entire conspiracy. He slammed a cheap plastic pen onto the paper, commanding me to sign it to save myself from dying in a maximum security medical prison. He leaned in, attempting to use his physical bulk to intimidate an old man into submission. He was severely underestimating his target. During my 4 decades expanding my commercial real estate empire, I had negotiated behind closed doors with ruthless city politicians, corrupt union bosses, and aggressive mob-tied contractors. I had faced down men who could make entire city blocks disappear overnight. Cheap, predictable police intimidation from a local precinct detective did not faze me in the slightest. I looked directly into Vance's sweating face, recognizing his desperate anxiety. I did not reach for the plastic pen resting on the table. I did not lean away from his aggressive, looming posture. I remained entirely silent. I shifted my cold gaze from the corrupt detective's flushed face and fixed my eyes squarely on the cheap, ticking analog clock mounted on the concrete wall above the door. I sat perfectly still, regulating my breathing into a slow, rhythmic pattern, transforming myself into an unmoving statue of pure, impenetrable granite. The second hand ticked forward with a loud mechanical click that echoed loudly in the confined space. Vance slammed his heavy fist against the metal table, demanding an immediate verbal response. He threatened to ensure I would be permanently locked in a padded cell, heavily medicated and completely erased from society without a trial. He yelled that my daughter was currently giving a tearful statement confirming my violent insanity and that my son-in-law was pressing maximum federal charges for the assault on the tarmac. I did not blink. I did not utter a single syllable to acknowledge his existence. In the high-stakes world of corporate negotiation, absolute silence is the ultimate weapon. It forces the weaker, desperate party to fill the void, to expose their deep insecurities, and to unravel their own strategy through sheer, uncontainable nervous energy. The ticking of the clock amplified in the freezing room. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes passed. Vance began to pace the narrow length of the room like a caged animal, his heavy shoes scuffing aggressively against the concrete floor. His face turned an angry, blotchy red as his frustration boiled over. He hurled vicious insults, mocked my age, and violently kicked the leg of the metal table, attempting to trigger any emotional reaction or physical flinch. I gave him absolutely nothing. I knew his growing desperation was directly tied to a rapidly closing window of opportunity. He needed this forced confession signed and filed before the local media caught wind of the airstrip shootout, and more importantly, before my actual highly paid legal representation discovered my undisclosed location. He leaned over me again, his breath hot against my face, threatening to physically force my hand around the pen and forge the signature himself. The tension in the small, freezing room reached an absolute suffocating boiling point. Vance drew his muscular arm back, preparing to escalate his psychological intimidation into outright physical violence. He believed he held absolute unchecked authority within these 4 concrete walls. Before Detective Vance could lay a single violent hand on my shoulder, the heavy steel door of the interrogation room was practically kicked off its reinforced hinges. The thick metal slammed backward against the concrete wall with a deafening crash that shook the entire precinct corridor. Vance spun around instantly, his hand dropping instinctively toward his holstered service weapon in pure panic. He froze completely, all the color draining from his sweating face. Standing in the doorway was my lead corporate attorney, Jonathan. His expensive tailored suit was immaculate, and his expression radiated absolute lethal legal authority. He had tracked my illegal arrest through emergency back channels, but Jonathan did not arrive at this corrupt local precinct alone to simply file a grievance. Flanking him on his right were two senior federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers prominently emblazoned with the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. On his left stood a stern, sharply dressed federal investigator representing the Securities and Exchange Commission. The ultimate unstoppable cavalry had arrived to dismantle this local corruption. Detective Vance took a staggering step backward, realizing his local jurisdiction had just been utterly obliterated by the full crushing weight of the federal government. The lead FBI agent stepped past Jonathan, flashing a gold badge that caught the harsh fluorescent light of the interrogation room. He did not ask for permission to enter. He looked at Detective Vance with an expression of absolute withering disgust. "Step away from the suspect and unfasten those shackles immediately," the federal agent ordered, his voice echoing with undeniable authority. Vance stammered, his sweaty face turning a sickly shade of gray as he instinctively raised his hands. "This is an active local kidnapping investigation," Vance weakly protested, pointing at the unsigned confession on the metal table. "We have jurisdiction over this precinct." Jonathan stepped forward, picking up the fraudulent confession and tearing it cleanly in half. "You have absolutely nothing, Detective," Jonathan stated coldly. "As of 2 minutes ago, the United States Attorney General authorized a complete federal takeover of this entire facility. You are hereby stripped of your badge, your weapon, and your clearance pending a massive internal affairs investigation regarding your illicit financial ties to Wyatt Mitchell." The second FBI agent moved swiftly, forcing Vance against the concrete wall and stripping him of his service weapon and police radio. Vance offered zero resistance, completely broken by the sudden crushing weight of the federal government. The agent pulled the heavy keys from Vance's belt and unlocked the iron shackles binding my wrists to the floor. I stood up slowly, rubbing my bruised skin, adjusting my cuffs with deliberate precision. The stifling, corrupt atmosphere of the local precinct had instantly evaporated. The playing field had shifted permanently. I was no longer a kidnapped victim or a hunted fugitive. I was the commanding architect of a federal takedown. I looked at Jonathan and nodded once. The real interrogation was about to begin. Just down the sterile linoleum hallway, the architects of my attempted murder were sitting in separate, heavily monitored interrogation rooms. They were completely unaware that their local paid-off protection had just been neutralized. Kendra sat perfectly upright in a rigid metal chair, her designer coat draped elegantly over her shoulders. She was actively performing the role of the traumatized, grieving daughter for the two local detectives assigned to her room. She dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue, haughtily demanding that her high-priced defense attorneys be allowed into the precinct immediately. She confidently believed her intricate web of lies held firm, convinced that I was currently being coerced into signing away my freedom down the hall. 2 doors away, Wyatt was projecting an entirely different but equally pathetic facade. A precinct medic had haphazardly bandaged the bleeding gash on the side of his head. He leaned back in his chair, exuding the fragile arrogance of a wealthy tech executive who believed his money shielded him from the law. He aggressively berated the junior officers, demanding a private phone call and threatening them with massive civil lawsuits for holding him without formal charges. Wyatt sincerely believed his local police bribes and his fabricated medical injunctions would shield him from the chaos of the airstrip shootout. He thought he could outsmart the legal system by playing the victim of a deranged kidnapping plot. Both of them were operating under the fatal delusion that they were the smartest people in the building. They thought they could simply lie their way out of a violent multi-million-dollar conspiracy by blaming a mentally unstable old man. They did not realize the federal government was already tightening the noose around their necks. I walked out of the holding cell and stepped directly into the precinct's primary observation room. The space had been entirely commandeered by federal agents. I took my seat at the head of the long conference table, flanked by Jonathan and the senior investigators. I reached into my pocket and placed the encrypted titanium flash drive squarely on the table. "Drop the hammer," I instructed Jonathan. He plugged the drive into the secure federal terminal. The room fell utterly silent as the crisp, undeniable audio recording filled the space. Kendra's venomous voice echoed through the high-definition speakers, explicitly promising the cartel boss that she would have his $5 million by Friday once her father was permanently liquidated. The FBI agents exchanged dark, hardened looks. They had investigated ruthless criminal syndicates, but the cold, sociopathic calculation of a daughter ordering her own father's execution chilled the room. Next, the Securities and Exchange Commission investigator accessed the extracted offshore financial logs. He rapidly verified the complex digital routing. The SEC investigator confirmed the massive corporate fraud without a shadow of a doubt. The data definitively proved Kendra siphoned the $5 million cartel loan directly out of Wyatt's failing tech startup, washing the funds through the Cayman Islands shell company before I intercepted and routed it back to the cartel. The paper trail was absolutely flawless and completely lethal. Meanwhile, the FBI lead agent reviewed the digital copy of the forged medical injunction and the audio of Dr. Aris confessing to the malpractice blackmail. The agent picked up his encrypted radio and issued a swift tactical command. Based entirely on the evidence I provided, a heavily armored local SWAT team was immediately dispatched. They executed a dynamic no-knock raid on Dr. Aris's private medical clinic, shattering his glass doors and arresting the corrupt physician before he could destroy a single original medical file. My evidence had just triggered a coordinated multi-agency tactical strike across the entire city. The foundational pillars of Kendra and Wyatt's conspiracy were completely obliterated in a matter of minutes. The lead FBI agent left the observation room carrying a thick stack of printed financial logs and walked directly into Wyatt's interrogation room. Wyatt immediately opened his mouth to demand his lawyer, but the agent slammed the documents onto the metal table. Wyatt stared at the detailed transaction records, realizing the federal government had just mapped his entire illegal financial history. The agent leaned down, getting inches from Wyatt's pale face. "We know about the $5 million you owe," the agent stated with chilling calmness. "And we know your wife stole it to set you up. But more importantly, the cartel knows. Our wiretaps confirm they just placed a $1 million bounty on your head for leaking their financial channels." Wyatt's arrogant facade instantly shattered. The blood drained from his face as pure suffocating terror took hold. He was a dead man the second he walked out of this precinct. The agent offered him a single brutal ultimatum. Wyatt realized his only chance of surviving federal prison and escaping cartel assassins was to accept a plea deal and formally testify against Kendra. The federal indictment hearing convened 3 weeks later in a packed downtown courthouse. The mahogany benches were completely overflowing with local reporters, federal agents, and spectators eager to witness the climax of the city's most scandalous corporate conspiracy. Kendra stood at the defense table wearing a modest pale gray suit designed specifically to drain her usual intimidating aura. She was delivering the absolute performance of a lifetime. When the federal judge asked her to enter her preliminary plea, she broke down into a series of perfectly timed, delicate sobs. She clutched a lace tissue, presenting herself to the gallery as the ultimate tragic victim of a violent, chaotic household. She addressed the bench with a trembling voice, aggressively spinning a fabricated narrative of relentless domestic abuse at the hands of her husband, Wyatt. She claimed he forced her to sign financial documents under the constant threat of physical violence. When the federal prosecutor brought up the recorded audio of her plotting my murder, Kendra did not flinch. She pivoted her strategy, seamlessly targeting me. She looked at the judge with wide, mournful eyes and claimed that my severe, undocumented dementia had completely warped my reality. She testified that the entire conspiracy was nothing more than the paranoid, fabricated delusion of a sick, elderly man whose mind was rapidly deteriorating. She painted herself as a loving daughter who was only trying to secure medical care for a father who had violently turned against his own family due to a failing brain. It was a masterful, sociopathic display of manipulation. The defense attorney stood beside her, nodding sympathetically, believing they had successfully planted the seed of reasonable doubt in the courtroom. The federal prosecutor called me to the witness stand. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom seemed to hold the collective breath of the gallery as I walked down the center aisle. I did not shuffle. I did not lean heavily on my silver-handled walking cane or portray the frail, confused grandfather Kendra had just described to the judge. I walked with the rigid, commanding posture of a man who owned the very concrete foundation this courthouse was built upon. When I took the oath and sat in the witness box, I did not address the court as a wounded victim of elder abuse. I spoke with the resonant, unwavering authority of a commercial real estate titan who had spent 4 decades physically shaping the skyline of this city. Decades ago, I sat in similar judicial chambers aggressively negotiating zoning laws, crushing hostile corporate takeovers, and dismantling corrupt syndicates that tried to bleed my developments dry. I knew exactly how to command the absolute attention and respect of every single person in the room. The federal judge, a stern man with 30 years on the bench, sat up straighter, recognizing immediately that he was not speaking to a vulnerable, dementia-riddled senior citizen. He was speaking to an apex predator of the corporate world. I looked directly at the defense table. Kendra's perfectly curated, sorrowful expression faltered for a fraction of a second. She recognized the cold, mechanical glint in my eyes. The facade of the heartbroken daughter was useless against the businessman who had funded her entire existence. The prosecutor stepped forward and asked me to recount the events of the airstrip and the offshore accounts. I adjusted my suit jacket and prepared to deliver the final lethal blow to her carefully constructed narrative. I did not raise my voice or rely on emotional theatrics. I clinically and methodically obliterated her defense with absolute precision. I started by producing the certified, decrypted logs of the Cayman Islands offshore shell company. The court clerk handed the heavily documented financial files directly to the judge. I pointed out the undeniable verified digital signature authenticating Kendra as the sole exclusive owner of the $5 million stolen from Wyatt's tech startup. I explained exactly how she had purposefully siphoned the cartel loan to frame her own husband, ensuring her defense of domestic coercion was instantly recognized as a blatant mathematical impossibility. Then the prosecutor played the high-definition audio file I had recorded outside her master bedroom. My daughter's vicious, arrogant voice echoed through the courtroom speakers, entirely devoid of the gentle tears she had just displayed. The gallery listened in absolute, horrified silence as she coldly promised the cartel enforcers that the money would be available by Friday once her father was permanently liquidated. The stark contrast between the weeping victim at the defense table and the calculating assassin on the audio recording destroyed her credibility entirely. I did not stop there. I requested the prosecutor submit the final piece of foundational evidence. It was a sworn, signed deposition from Wyatt. Sitting in federal custody and terrified of the cartel bounty on his head, my son-in-law had accepted a comprehensive plea deal. He had surrendered every detail of the conspiracy, providing sworn testimony that Kendra was the absolute mastermind who engineered the fraudulent medical injunction and the life insurance plot. He testified under oath that she orchestrated the fake psychiatric transport with the explicit intention of murdering me on the highway. The judge reviewed the staggering mountain of irrefutable evidence. He slowly lowered the documents and looked directly down at Kendra. The professional neutrality required of his position vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. He was looking at a woman who had tried to murder the father who gave her everything simply to collect an insurance payout and leave her husband to be butchered by cartel mercenaries. Her defense was entirely dead. The federal judge struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack that silenced the murmuring gallery. Based on the overwhelming volume of physical and digital evidence, the judge formally denied any possibility of bail. He explicitly declared Kendra a severe flight risk, citing the millions of dollars she had attempted to move internationally and her violent interception at the private airstrip. He ordered her immediately remanded to a maximum security federal holding facility to await trial. The pristine, tragic mask Kendra had worn all morning instantly and violently shattered. The sophisticated socialite vanished, replaced by a cornered, rabid animal. She lunged forward against the defense table, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure malice. She screamed vicious, guttural obscenities directly at me, her voice echoing wildly off the mahogany walls. 2 large federal marshals immediately flanked her, grabbing her arms and forcefully wrestling her away from the table. Heavy steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around her wrists. She thrashed and kicked, screaming that she deserved the money, completely stripped of her wealth, her elite social status, and her freedom. I sat in the witness box in absolute silence, watching coldly as my daughter was violently dragged out of the courtroom in chains. The deafening roar of the media circus eventually faded as all manufactured spectacles do, replaced by the quiet, predictable, and relentless machinery of the federal justice system. The news anchors who had so eagerly broadcasted my supposed fiery demise moved on to the next sensational headline, leaving the cold ashes of my daughter's conspiracy firmly in the past. Wyatt and Kendra were rapidly stripped of their tailored designer suits, their luxury imported cars, and their unearned, arrogant social status. They were locked away in separate maximum security federal penitentiaries. Wyatt, absolutely terrified of the cartel bounty that still loomed lethally over his head, had eagerly accepted a binding plea deal. That agreement guaranteed him 30 years behind reinforced concrete walls in exchange for his full, unredacted cooperation against his wife. He would spend the rest of his miserable, pathetic life looking over his shoulder in the prison yard, jumping at every shadow. Kendra fared far worse. Without the immense protection of my wealth or the fragile shield of her fabricated victimhood, the federal judge threw the absolute maximum weight of the law at her. She was sentenced to 45 consecutive years without the slightest possibility of parole for conspiracy to commit murder, corporate fraud, and international money laundering. The sophisticated woman who once believed she was the smartest, most untouchable person in any room was now nothing more than a formatted inmate number confined to an 8 by 10-foot steel cage for the remainder of her natural life. She had attempted to orchestrate a multi-million-dollar corporate assassination to fund her lavish parasitic lifestyle, but her grand design had collapsed into a lifetime of institutional gray. The sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion they had lived in was seized and quickly liquidated by the federal government to settle the outstanding cartel debts and massive IRS penalties. Their entire toxic artificial world was systematically erased from existence, leaving absolutely no trace of the empire they tried to steal. With the architects of my attempted murder permanently removed from society, my immediate singular priority shifted from corporate vengeance to familial preservation. The true innocent casualty of Kendra and Wyatt's sociopathic greed was not my bank account, but my 7-year-old grandson. Leo had been forced to witness the terrifying, violent reality of his parents' betrayal, but I absolutely refused to let their criminal corruption dictate his future. I initiated definitive, aggressive legal action through the family court system, leveraging my absolute financial stability and the felony convictions of his biological parents to terminate their parental rights entirely. Within a month, the courts formally and legally finalized my adoption of Leo as my own son. I moved us completely out of the city, purchasing a sprawling, highly secure private estate surrounded by dense protective acreage and state-of-the-art surveillance. I completely insulated him from the toxic, manipulative environment he had been born into. I did not raise him with the same blind, indulgent luxury that had ultimately poisoned Kendra. I raised him with hard, undeniable truths, unwavering discipline, and genuine, unconditional love. I taught him the profound, essential value of earning his own way, ensuring he understood early on that respect and character are built through deliberate action, not inherited through a wealthy bloodline. He thrived in the quiet, structured safety of our new life. The lingering fear that once clouded his young eyes vanished entirely, replaced by the confident, bright resilience of a boy who knew he was absolutely protected. He was no longer a disposable pawn in a deadly corporate game. He was my true legacy, and I was going to dedicate the rest of my days to ensuring he became a man of ironclad integrity. Securing my family was only the first half of my final counteroffensive. I still had a massive corporate empire to forcefully purge. The terrifying ease with which Wyatt had executed his fraudulent medical injunction exposed a catastrophic, unacceptable vulnerability within my own internal corporate infrastructure. The highly paid executive board members of my primary trust had blindly accepted the legal conservatorship without launching a single independent investigation. They had cowardly bowed to a forged piece of paper instead of fiercely protecting the founder who had enriched them for decades. I did not accept their pathetic, groveling apologies or their frantic, panicked justifications. I called a mandatory executive meeting at my primary corporate headquarters. I walked into the grand boardroom, looked at the dozen men and women sitting nervously around the massive mahogany table, and fired every single one of them on the spot. I legally stripped them of their lucrative stock options, severed their golden parachutes with aggressive litigation clauses, and marched them out of the glass building under the strict supervision of armed corporate security. With the unloyal parasites removed, I fundamentally restructured the entire foundation of my multi-million-dollar real estate development firm. I legally dissolved the standard generational inheritance trusts that would have passively transferred my wealth to entitled heirs. Instead, I redirected the vast majority of my liquid capital and commercial dividends into a newly established, aggressively funded philanthropic foundation. I designed the airtight trust to provide massive full-ride urban development scholarships and zero-interest commercial business grants for underprivileged youth in the inner city. The massive empire I built from the dirt would be used explicitly to pull others up from that exact same dirt. I ensured that long after I was gone, My wealth would physically build the community, construct new infrastructure, and fund the education of brilliant minds who actually knew the value of hard work. The money would never again serve as a weapon for greedy, ungrateful descendants to wield. It would be a permanent, continually expanding force for absolute good. I had successfully insulated my entire life's work from ever being exploited or stolen again. 6 months after the federal trial concluded, I sat in a heavy oak rocking chair on the back porch of my newly purchased, heavily fortified estate. The late afternoon air was crisp and beautifully clean. Out on the expansive green lawn, Leo was safely running with a golden retriever puppy, his uninhibited laughter echoing brightly across the secure property. The heavy iron gates at the front of the estate buzzed open, and Jonathan walked up the long stone pathway. My trusted lawyer approached the porch and silently handed me a standard, heavily stamped prison envelope. The return address printed in the corner indicated it was from the maximum security federal penitentiary. It was from Kendra. Jonathan mentioned briefly that she was begging for commissary money and pleading for my forgiveness. I did not open the envelope. I did not even glance at her handwriting. I simply leaned over and dropped the sealed letter directly into the heavy-duty industrial shredder I kept plugged in beside my chair. The machine whirred violently, instantly reducing her desperate, manipulative pleas to meaningless, unreadable strips of paper. I picked up my mug, took a slow, satisfying sip of my black coffee, and looked back out at my grandson playing in the fading light. I watched the golden sunset dip below the distant tree line, completely surrounded by absolute, untethered peace. The final lesson I learned is that wealth without earned character is a deadly poison. When you hand ungrateful children a life of unearned luxury, you are not protecting them. You are actively destroying their moral foundation. They will eventually view you not as a parent, but as an obstacle to their inheritance. A true legacy is never built on bloodline alone. It is forged by empowering those who actually understand the value of hard work and integrity. Did my story resonate with you? Let me know in the comments below. Please hit that subscribe button for more life stories.